Selections from The War and the Churches by Joseph McCabe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Panos. Preface. The searching crisis through which the nation is passing must have the effect of securing grave consideration for many aspects of our life and institutions. We have already traversed the acute stage of suspense and are gradually becoming sensible of these wider considerations. It was natural that, for a prolonged period, the disturbance of our economic conditions, the anxiety for the safety of our nation in face of an appalling menace, the personal concern of millions about the lives of sons or brothers who have bravely responded to the call, should keep our thoughts enchained to the daily or hourly fortunes of the field of battle. Now that the initial disorder has been allayed and we have attained a quiet and reasonable confidence in the issue, we turn to other and broader aspects of this mighty event of our generation. How comes it that the most enlightened century the world has yet seen should be thus darkened by one of the bloodiest and most calamitous wars that have ever spread their awful wings over the life of man? Where is all the optimism of yesterday? Must we reconsider our reasoned boast that our civilization has lifted the life of man to a level hitherto unattained? Is there something entirely and most mischievously wrong with the foundations of modern civilization? A dozen such questions will press for an answer, but it will be granted that one of the most urgent and interesting of the many grave considerations which the war suggests is its relation to the prevailing creeds and standards of conduct. The war coincides with an advanced stage of what is called the spread of unbelief. In each of the nations of Europe which are engaged in this awful struggle, complaints have been made every year for the last 2 or 3 generations that Christianity is losing its moral control of the white race. In the cities, especially in the capitals of Europe, there has been a proved and acknowledged decay of church-going. And however much we may be disposed to think that these millions who no longer attend church retain in their minds the beliefs of their fathers, the slender circulation of religious literature makes it plain that the vast majority of them do not, in point of fact, receive either the spoken or written message of the Christian Church. In the great cities, and it is undoubted that the life of a nation is mainly controlled by its cities, there has been an increasing reluctance to listen to the authoritative exponents of the Christian gospel. A number of the clergy have very naturally noticed and stressed this coincidence. Prelates of high authority have, as we shall see, even declared that the war is a scourge deliberately laid on the back of mankind by the Almighty on account of this spreading infidelity. As a rule, the clergy shrink from advocating a theory which has such grave implications as this has, and they are content to submit the more plausible suggestion that the decay of the Christian standard of conduct in the mind of a large proportion of our generation accounts for this tragic combat of nations. A distinguished positivist writer, Mr. J. Cotter Morrison, commenting in the last generation on the decay of Christian belief, expressed some such concern in the following terms. It would be rash to expect that a transition, unprecedented for its width and difficulty, from theology to positivism, from the service of God to the service of man, could be accomplished without jeopardy. Signs are not wanting that the prevalent anarchy in thought is leading to anarchy in morals. Numbers who have put off belief in God have not put on belief in humanity. A common and lofty standard of duty is being trampled down in the fierce battle of incompatible principles. It is true that in the work from which I quote the learned, if somewhat nervous positivist does not, by his masterly survey of the moral history of Europe, afford us the least reason to think that we have really deteriorated from the standard of conduct set us by earlier generations, but his words do tend to press on our notice the claim of many writers, clerical and non-clerical, that we are returning from Christianity to paganism, from a settled moral discipline to an unhealthy moral skepticism. Can one entirely and safely reconstruct the bases of personal and national conduct in 1 or 2 generations? This very plain and plausible theory is, however, exposed to criticism from other points of view. The clergy as a body are not at all willing to concede that the decay of belief has spread as far as the theory would suggest. In order to suppose that the life of Europe has, in a matter of the gravest importance, been directed by a non-Christian spirit, one must assume that at least the majority in each nation have deserted the traditional creed. It is by no means conceded or established that the fighting nations have ceased to be predominantly Christian. Indeed, if we confine the awful responsibility for this tragedy, as the evidence compels us, to Germany and Austria-Hungary, we are casting it upon the two nations which have been the chief representatives in Europe of the two leading branches of the Church. Most assuredly no prelate of either country would admit that his nation has ceased to be Christian or surrendered its life to non-Christian impulses, and in our own country we have frequently been assured of late years that the real power of Christianity was never greater. Clearly, these conflicting claims and this contrast of profession and practice suggest a problem that deserves consideration. The problem becomes the more interesting, and the plausible theory of non-Christian responsibility is even more severely shaken when we reflect that war is not an innovation of this unbelieving age, but a legacy from the earlier and more thoroughly Christian period. Had mankind departed from some admirable practice of submitting its international quarrels to a religious arbitrator, and in our own times devised this horrible arbitrament of the sword, we should be more disposed to seek the cause in a contemporary enfeeblement of moral standards. This is notoriously not the case. Men have warred and priests have blessed the banners which were to wave over fields of blood from the very beginning of Christian influence, not to speak of earlier religious epochs. There is assuredly a ghastly magnitude about modern war which almost lends it an element of novelty, but the appearance is illusory. That intense employment of resources which makes modern war so sanguinary tends also to shorten its duration. No military struggle could now be prolonged into the period of the Napoleonic Wars, to say nothing of the 30 Years' War, which involved the death with every circumstance of ferocity of immensely larger numbers than could be effected by any modern war. Nor may we forget that it is the modern spirit which has claimed some alleviation of the horrors of the field, and that the majority of the nations engaged in the present struggle have observed the new rules. These considerations show that the problem is less simple and more serious than is often supposed, and I set out to discuss each of them with some fullness. That the war has no relation to the churches will hardly be claimed by anybody. Such a claim would mean that they were indifferent to one of the very gravest phases of human conduct or wholly unable to influence it. Nor can we avoid the issue by pleading that Christianity approves and blesses a just defensive war, and that since the share of this country in the war is entirely just and defensive, we have no moral problem to consider. I have assuredly no intention of questioning either the justice of Britain's conduct or the prudence of the churches in adapting the maxims of the Sermon on the Mount to the practical needs of life. If and when a nation sees its life and prosperity threatened by an ambitious or a jealous neighbour, one cannot but admire its clergy for joining in the advocacy of an efficient and triumphant defence. But this is merely a superficial and proximate consideration. Not the actual war only, but the military system of which it is the occasional outcome, has a very pertinent relation to religion. The maintenance of this machinery for settling international quarrels in an age in which applied science makes it so formidable is a very grave moral issue. It turns our thoughts at once to those branches of the Christian Church which claim the predominant share in the moulding of the conduct of Europe. But these questions of the efficacy of Christian teaching or the influence of Christian ministers are not the only or the most interesting questions suggested by the relation of the war to the prevailing religion. The great tragedy which darkens the earth today raises again in its most acute form the problem of evil and providence. More than 2,000 years ago, as Job reminds us, some difficulty was experienced in justifying the ways of God to men. The most penetrating thinker of the early church, St. Augustine, wrestled once more with the problem as if no word had been written on it, and he wrestled in vain. A century and a half ago, when the Lisbon earthquake destroyed 40,000 Portuguese, Voltaire attempted with equal unsuccess to vindicate Providence with the faint hope of the deist. Modern science, prolonging the sufferings of living things over earlier millions of years, has made that problem one of the great issues of our age, and this dread spectacle of human nature, read in tooth and claw, brings it impressively before us. Is the work of God restricted to counting the hairs of the head, and not enlarged to check the murderous thoughts in the human brain? Nay, when we survey those horrid stretches of desolation in Belgium and Poland and Serbia, where the mutilated bodies of the innocent, of women and children, lie amidst the ashes of their homes, when we think of those peaceful sailors of our mercantile marine at the bottom of the deep, those unoffending civilians whose flesh was torn by shells, those hundreds of thousands whom patriotic feeling alone has summoned to the vast tombs of Europe, those millions of homes that have been darkened by suspense and loss, how can we repeat the ancient assurance that God does count the hairs of the head and mark the fall of even the sparrows? Does God move the insensate stars only, and leave to the less skilful guidance of man those momentous little atoms which make up the brain of statesmen? These are reflections which must occur to every thoughtful person in the later and more meditative phases of a great war, when the eye has grown somewhat weary of the glitter of steel and the colour of banners, when the world mourns about us and the long lists of the dead and longer list of the stupendous waste sober the mind. Something is gravely wrong with our international life, and plainly it is not a question whether that international life departs from the Christian standard, but why, after 1,500 years of mighty Christian influence, it does so depart. Is the moral machinery of Europe ineffective? One certainly cannot say that it has not had a prolonged trial, yet here, in the 20th century, we have, in the most terrible form, one of the most appalling evils which human agency ever brought upon human hearts. We have to reconsider our religious and ethical position, to ask ourselves whether, if the influence of religion has failed to direct men into paths of wisdom and peace, some other influence may not be found which will prove more persuasive and more beneficent. Chapter 3. The Apologies of the Clergy. Any person who cares to read the reports of the utterances of our clergy in the current religious periodicals will recognize that they are painfully conscious of the reproach which this war implies. One constantly finds them repeating that in this year of tragedy Christianity has failed, and the gospel has broken in our hands. It has been their boast that Christianity had civilized Europe, and none of them has the audacity or indecency to claim, as some writers have done, that such a war is in harmony with the principles and ideals of civilization. They have preached brotherhood and peace, and the greater part of Christendom is engaged in a strife of the most terrible nature. It is not a struggle of Christian and infidel, it is a struggle of Christian, and one or several of the Christian nations involved are guilty of a crime greater in magnitude than all the murders in Europe during a decade. Above all patriotism, above all immediate anxiety, above all argumentation about responsibility, this grim fact stands out and reproaches them. After 1,500 years of Christian preaching, Europe is locked in the bloodiest struggle of all time. During the last 50 or 100 years, the clergy have developed some expertness in making apologies. They have lived in a world of anxious questions and heated charges, and a special department called apologetics has been added to theology. They are, it is true, sorely perplexed, divided in council, uneasy as to their procedure. Some would ignore the pertinacious outsider and persuade their followers that he is negligible. Others would sustain an energetic campaign against him. Some would openly and candidly meet the questions of their followers. Others would prefer not to unsettle the large number who never ask questions. At the present juncture it is impossible to be wholly silent. Some of the clergy, it seems, I learn this from the recorded words of eminent preachers, wish to ignore the war and go on with their business as usual, but the majority feel that such a procedure is dangerous. This violent breach of Christian principles by Christian nations requires some explanation. Where is the long-boasted moral influence of Christianity? Where is the all-loving ruler of the universe? Let us examine some of the apologies of the preachers. Let me confess that from a long experience of this apologetic branch of theology, I am not surprised to find that not a single speaker or writer, as far as my reading of their utterances goes, fairly meets the main difficulty. Most of them naturally are content to plead that the war has been forced on Europe by Germany, and that therefore no responsibility lies on Christianity as a whole for the tragedy and the moral failure it involves. A large number of them go even further. They point to the heroic sacrifices made in defense of an ideal by France, Belgium, England, and Russia, the millions of men streaming to the battlefield, the millions of women bravely enduring the suspense and the loss, the millions who generously open their purses to every philanthropic enterprise, and they acclaim this as a triumph of Christian civilization. As to the failure of Christianity in Germany to stand the test, they either point superficially to the growth of rationalism, biblical criticism, and socialism in that country, or they take refuge in the confusions of the extreme pacifists and refuse to assign responsibility at all, or they persuade themselves that a small minority of men who were not Christians deluded the German people into consenting to the war. In any case, they insist that Christianity as a whole is not impeached. Assume that Austria was dragged into the war by Germany, and you have 4 Christian nations, 5 if one includes Serbia, behaving with great gallantry and entire propriety, and only 1 Christian nation misbehaving. There is no doubt that this is the common religious attitude, but it does not satisfy some of the more thoughtful and earnest preachers. This optimism seems to them rebuked by the very fact that Christendom is in a state of war to which paganism can offer no parallel. They think of the lands beyond the sea to which they have been sending the Christian message of peace and brotherhood. They fancy they see China and Japan smiling their faint but distressing smile at the situation in Christian Europe. They have assured all these distant peoples that their faith has built up a shining civilization in Europe, and now there flash and quiver through the nerves of the world the daily messages of horror, of fierce hatred, of appalling carnage, of the wanton destruction by Christians of Christian temples. The gospel has somehow broken down in Europe, they regretfully admit. But they never go beyond this vague admission and boldly state the sin of the churches. One would imagine that, in spite of its obvious and lamentable failure, they still thought that their predecessors had been justified in preaching only the general terms of the Christian gospel and never applying it to war. One would fancy that they are so unacquainted with history as to suppose that during the long ages of the past, the churches were really frowning on violence and warfare, instead of blessing and employing it. They fear to draw out in its full proportion the inefficacy, because of its vagueness, of the gospel and the long perversion of its ministers. Yet we cannot evade this fundamental fact of the situation, that this particular war is an outcome of a general military system, and the churches have a very grave responsibility for the maintenance of that system until the 20th century. We all know how the technical moral theologian of recent times has glossed the complacency of his church. He has drawn a distinction between offensive and defensive war, and, since the latter is obviously just, he has maintained that armies are rightly raised to wage it when necessary. On this petty fallacy, the churches have so long reconciled themselves to militarism, and have in fact been among its closest allies. The clergy did not or would not see that the retention of the military system was in itself the surest provocation of offensive war, that ambition or covetousness could almost always find a moral pretext for aggression, and that there have been comparatively few priests in the history of Europe who ever stood out and unmasked the hypocrisy of such monarchs. As long as the military system lasted, it was certain that wars would take place, yet they never denounced the system. The great conception of substituting justice for violence, law for lawlessness, did not enter the mind of Christianity. It was born of the secular humanitarian spirit of modern times. For any serious person, this is the gravest charge which the clergy have to meet, and they one and all evade it. The civilization of Europe has a unique greatness on its material side, in its applied science, its engineering, its industries, its commerce. For that, assuredly, the churches are not in any degree responsible. Our civilization is unique also in its political power, its mastery over other peoples, and for that, again, the churches are not responsible. It is great on the intellectual side, in its science and philosophy, its art and general culture, and that greatness, too, has been won independently of or in defiance of the clergy. On the moral side only it may plausibly be connected with its established religion, and here precisely it fails and approaches barbarism. I do not wonder that the churches are troubled, and do not wonder greatly that they are silent. But while they are silent on the main issue, they have a vast amount to say about minor issues and secondary aspects. They console and reconcile their people in 100 ways. Actually, they seem in a great measure to entertain the idea that the churches are going to emerge from this trial stronger than ever, and to witness at last that religious revival which they had almost begun to despair of securing. Let me examine a few of these clerical pronouncements. I do not choose the eccentric sermons of ill-educated rural preachers, but the utterances of some of the more distinguished preachers, reproduced with pride and honour in the leading religious periodicals. Yet no person can coldly reflect on these pronouncements and fail to realize that our generation acts not unnaturally in passing by the open doors of the churches, that the clergy are, as usual, shirking the most serious questions of the modern intelligence, and trusting mainly to profit by the heated and disordered and confusing emotions of the hour. One of the most extraordinary of these deliverances reaches me from Australia, but as it comes from one of the leading prelates of the Commonwealth, and does assuredly express what multitudes of preachers are saying everywhere, I do not hesitate to give it prominence. Archbishop Carr of Melbourne set out in the middle of the war to enlighten his followers, and his words are reported with great deference in the Melbourne Age. The prelate observed that he had very strong ideas about the war, and did not believe it had happened by accident or by the chance action of some king or emperor. He believed that the great God who provided for all human creatures through the war was punishing sin that had prevailed for a long time, particularly in the shape of infidelity. The Archbishop proved from history and the Bible that war did come sometimes as a punishment of sin, and he concluded, or the journal thus summarizes his conclusion: "The reason that God was using the present war for the punishment of nations was that for a very considerable time there had been not merely neglect of the worship and service of God, which had always existed to a greater or less extent, but a regular upraising of human light and human understanding and human will against the existence of the providence of God. It was not so common among us here, but there were countries in Europe in which the spirit of infidelity and the absence of supernatural faith had been increasing for many years. Men were coming to think they were quite sufficient in themselves for the working out of their own destinies, but the war had come, and it was humbling such men." Archbishop Carr is not adduced here as a representative type of clerical culture. On what grounds the Roman Catholic authorities select men like him and the late Cardinal Moran to preside over the destinies of their church in our great and promising Commonwealth is not clear. In the course of this important sermon, in which he is delivering his very personal and mature conclusions on the greatest issue of the hour, the Archbishop observed that the Roman Empire had been attacked by Attila, and Attila scourged the Romans for the crimes of which they had for a long while been guilty. One is surprised that he did not add the pretty legend of the awestruck Hun retreating before the majestic figure of Pope Leo I. However, most of us are aware that as a student in any college of Australia ought to be able to inform the Archbishop, Attila never reached within 200 miles of Rome, and that the pagan Romans, whom the Archbishop obviously has in mind, had been extinguished long before the monarch of the Huns was born. There is no greater historical scholarship in the other proofs which the prelate brings in support of his thesis that war is often deliberately sent as a punishment. But what are we to make of the moral standards of an eminent prelate of the Roman Church who can hold and express so appalling a theory? It is based on the moral standard of the Prussian officer, of the medieval torturer. The majority of clergymen have at length come to realize, tardily and reluctantly, that the man or woman who rejects the creeds they offer may quite possibly not believe in them. The practice of describing a refusal to assent to the doctrine of hell and heaven as a willful rebellion of passion against the restraining influences of Christianity is going out of fashion. Christian people were meeting too many heretics in the flesh and did not recognize the thing described from the pulpit. The sturdy Archbishop will have none of this pampering. Unbelief is a matter of the will as well as the understanding, and he actually believes that God guided the thoughts of William II in engineering this war, believes it for a reason 100 times worse than the Kaiser's idea. He believes that God sent on Europe a war that will cost £10 billion, that is blasting the homes and embittering the hearts of millions, that mingles the innocent and guilty in one common and fearful desolation, that sends millions to a premature death amidst circumstances which do not lend themselves to a devout preparation, that is raising storms of hatred and perverting the souls of millions, because a few other millions refuse to go to church. It would be difficult to conceive a cruder and more barbarous idea. Attila did not scourge the Romans, but he did scourge other peoples, and we hold him up to execration forever for it. But Archbishop Carr and many other preachers think that an all-holy and all-intelligent God can do infinitely worse than Attila. He is going to punish the unbelievers in eternal fire when they die. Meantime, he will make a hell on earth for the innocent as well as the supposed guilty, the child and the mother as well as the free-thinking father. Of a truth, it is not surprising that a reluctance to listen to sermons has spread to Melbourne, and that men are wondering whether they had better not take in hand their own destinies, rather than entrust them to such spiritual guides as this. Note particularly in passing the emphasis which the Archbishop puts on the determination of our generation to control its own destinies. Until the 19th century, men entrusted their destinies on the moral side to guides like Archbishop Carr. I have described the result. In the 19th century there began this practice which the Archbishop thinks worthy of so inhuman a chastisement of men attending to their own moral interests. Of this also I have described the result. The moral sentiment of Europe has greatly improved, and there is at least a widespread revolt against warfare and a prospect of abolishing it. For this God, the more than human, scorched Europe with the horrible flames which Archbishop Carr thinks he keeps in his arsenal of torture implements. The Archbishop says that infidelity has not spread so much in Australia. I should, if I were not well acquainted with the Commonwealth, be disposed to see in that the reason why eminent prelates can still utter such gross medieval nonsense in that country. In England, this particularly crude type of nonsense is not usually uttered by preachers of distinction, though it is common enough among less responsible preachers, but there is a dangerous approach to it in some of the sermons which the religious periodicals regard as important. Looking over the current issues of the religious press, I notice a sermon on the war by Professor Clough, in which the Allies are, in harmony with his test, described as the vultures of God. Germany, it seems, is the prey, and Germany's sins are painted black. Professor Clow, it is true, shrinks from the very natural implication of his words, but he clearly intimates that he sees the action of God in the military conduct of the Allies, and to that extent he is hardly less revolting in view of his culture than the Archbishop. Could the God of Professor Clow find no other way of removing Germany's arrogance than to sear and blast it with a world war and involve millions of innocent along with the guilty in his lakes of fire and blood? More important, however, is a sermon delivered before the recent National Free Church Council by one of the most esteemed nonconformist preachers, the Reverend J. H. Rushbrook, and reproduced admiringly in the nonconformist journals. The cloud of war naturally brooded over this gathering of ministers. Some of them heroically closed their eyes to it and went on with their clerical business as usual, but most of the speakers seemed to have felt that all other issues were thrust aside in the minds of their followers just now, and that a grave and soul-shaking question possessed them. As a result, we have, I suppose, the finest efforts of nonconformity to meet that question and save the prestige of the churches. Mr. Rushbrook frankly described the war as an overwhelming catastrophe, gravely disturbing the religious mind. It bore witness, he said, to the failure of organized or disorganized Christianity. He conceived it as God's judgment upon the Church's failure to seriously devote herself to the great cause of peace on earth and goodwill among men. With all their boasts of what Christianity had done in Europe, it now appeared that that civilization was raised upon foundations of sand. The preacher claimed that much was being done in modern times by the clergy to promote international amity, but he seemed to feel that it was little and was very recent. The spectacle unfolded before us in Europe today is a sufficient proof of its inadequacy, and, as Mr. Rushbrook said, we now see how little use it is to preach ideals at home and not apply them to the common life of the world. These words are the nearest to wisdom that I have found among a large collection of pulpit utterances and religious articles. The preacher plainly sees, and with some measure of candour confesses, that long remissness of Christian ministers in applying their principles to which the war and all wars are fundamentally due. The record which he carefully makes of recent efforts to redeem the failure is paltry in comparison with the resources even of the free churches, and only serves to bring out more clearly the awful neglect of Christian ministers during the long ages when they had a mighty power in Europe. But Mr. Rushbrook makes one grave error. He feels that not merely the relation of the war to Christianity, but its relation to God is engaging public attention, and he stumbles into the theory that God sent the war. It is God's judgment on the Church's failure. We must suppose that Mr. Rushbrook did not literally mean what he said. His words imply a theory of the war more monstrous even than that of Archbishop Carr. To punish Europe for the sins of unbelievers has at least a genuine medieval plausibility about it, but to send this indescribable plague on the nations of Europe because the clergy failed to do their duty— one must really assume that Mr. Rushbrook did not mean what he said and leave the sentence unfinished. What he meant it is impossible to conjecture. To the religious mind, God's judgment means a chastisement sent by God. But whatever Mr. Rushbrook meant, he had been wiser to leave the idea of God out of his comments on this war, and to say frankly that it would bring on them and their predecessors, on the whole of Christianity, the judgment of man and the judgment of history for their neglect of their opportunities. The Reverend A.T. Guttery addressed the council in a more cheerful mood, and his reflections are characteristic of a large group of the clergy. He would not for a moment allow the failure of Christianity. The churches had, he said, been so successful in compelling the world to recognize the evil of aggressive warfare that even the Germans were eager to describe their action as purely defensive. The pagan glory of war for its own sake was gone, and when we acknowledge the comparative failure of religion in Germany and restrict our attention to the sphere of our own clergy, we find that they have created an entirely new spirit. The lust for territory and gold is felt no more in England. Here there is no mafficking over victories, there are no hymns of hate. The British nation has been sobered by the influence of Christianity. We may regret that the German people has not proved equally susceptible, and its pastors equally energetic, but we cannot bear their burden. Their naughtiness alone has disturbed the moral progress which, even in this department, Christianity was fostering. This is, I think, a very usual attitude of the clergy, and I have already appreciated the sound element of it. There is no comparison between the behaviour of the two nations. Whether England deserves quite all the compliments which Mr. Guthrie showers upon it may be a matter of opinion. We have as yet little cause for mafficking, but there is very little doubt that it will occur on a grandiose scale before the war is over. We do not sing hymns of hate, but it might be hazardous to speculate what we would do if some nation drew an iron ring round our country and reduced us almost to a condition of starvation. We have no lust for territory. I am not sure about the lust for gold, because we have in our empire territory enough for our population, and we may wait to see if England does not annex any part of Germany's African or Pacific possessions. Mr. Guthrie's contrast is crude and superficial. He ignores the economic feeling and geographical conditions which give us a feeling of content, and Germany a profound feeling of discontent and a dangerous ambition. The German character is not in itself inferior to ours, and it were well for us to fancy ourselves in Germany's position and wonder if we would have acted otherwise. On the other hand, I have freely acknowledged or claimed that there has been a great improvement in the moral temper of Europe, and that this is especially seen in the odium that is now cast on aggressive or offensive war. But to claim this improvement for the credit of religion is, to say the least, audacious. The more simple-minded of Mr. Guthrie's hearers would imagine that the change set in with the fall of paganism. The pagan glory of war for its own sake is gone. When clerical writers speak of paganism, they think that any evil deed ever done by a pagan is characteristic of the whole body. They ask us to apply a different standard to their own body. Plato and Socrates were pagans, Marcus Aurelius and Antonius Pius, to speak of warriors and statesmen, were pagans. The truth is that a glory in war for its own sake was no more generally characteristic of paganism than it was of Christian Europe. Until a century ago it was probably less. Most of the German emperors and the kings of England, France and Spain would fairly come under the description which Mr. Guthrie calls pagan. One hardly needs to know much of history to perceive that this moral improvement in the conception of war belongs to the last century and a half, and it is somewhat bold to claim that a change which made no appearance during 1,000 years of profound Christian influence, and did begin to appear and make progress as that faith waned, can be claimed for Christianity. I do not forget that the theologian began long ago, in the seclusion of his cell or study, to condemn offensive warfare. But there have been hundreds of offensive wars waged by Christian monarchs since that date, and we do not read of any instance in which the clergy failed to endorse the thin casuistry by which the offensive was turned into a defensive or a preventative war, or refused to sanction an entire neglect of the principle. Dr. Scott Lidgett followed on somewhat similar lines. The whole trouble, he protested, was due to an anti-Christian, illiberal and inhuman system. It seems that he was referring to pressure, and it is regrettable that he did not feel called to explain why that system prevails in the year of the Lord 1915, or how it finds an instrument of its ambition in a militarism that ought to have been denounced and abolished centuries ago. Mr. Shakespeare, another distinguished nonconformist, follows the same facile course, casts all the responsibility on Germany, and equally fails to explain how Germany came to find the machinery of destruction at its hand in our age. In fine, Dean Weldon, one of the most energetic spokesmen of the Church of England, addressed this Free Church Council and imparted an element of originality. He used the inconclusive and dangerous argument of tu quoque. If, he said, you claim this war exhibits the failure of Christianity, you must admit that it shows equally the failure of science and civilization. Nay, he says, growing bolder, if your contention is true, Christianity has done no more than supply the instrument of its own destruction, but science and civilization have brought us back to savagery. It is, of course, difficult to follow a man's rounded thought in the crabbed phrases of an abbreviating reporter, but it is plain that Dean Weldon has here been guilty of a confusion which only betrays his apologetic poverty in the face of this great crisis. Science, and it is especially science that the clergy conceive as the rival they have to discredit, has no concern whatever with the war. Science, either as an organized body of teachers or as a branch of culture, has never discussed war and never had the faintest duty or opportunity to do so. Economic science may discuss particular aspects of war, but the economist deals with things as they are, not as they ought to be. Moral science even is not a preaching agency, desirous of dividing with the clergy the ethical guidance of the people. When men pit science against religion, they usually refer to its superior power of explaining reality, and if it be objected that therefore no morally educative agency would remain if religion were discarded, the answer is simple. A system of moral idealism founded on science does exist, and might at any time be enlarged to the proportions of a national or international educative agency. As yet it is left to individual cultivation, or crystallized in a few tiny associations, such as ethical and secularist and partly socialist societies, and I venture to say from a large experience of these bodies that, apart from the professed peace societies, they have been more assiduous than any religious associations in England in proportion to their work in demanding the substitution of arbitration for war, and that the overwhelming majority, almost the entirety of their members are pacifists. To speak of this small organized force, with its slender influence, as equally discredited with the far mightier and 1,000-year-older influence of the churches would be strangely incongruous, and it is hardly less incongruous to drag science into the comparison. A somewhat similar distinction must be observed in regard to civilization. The antithesis of religion and civilization is confused and confusing. Christian ministers have claimed that they are the moral element of civilization, and they have jealously combated every effort to take from them or divide with them that function. They resist every attempt to exclude their almost useless Bible lessons from our schools, and to substitute for them a direct and more practical moral education of children. They have for 1,500 years claimed and possessed the monopoly of ethical culture in European civilization, and we are a little puzzled when they turn round and say, with an air of argument, that if Christianity has failed, civilization has also failed. There is only one civilization in Europe that has attempted to substitute a humanitarian for a religious training of conduct, one nation that is plainly and overwhelmingly non-Christian. That nation is France, and France has one of the best moral records in modern Europe, and has behaved nobly throughout this lamentable business. In fine, if we take Dean Weldon's words in the most generous sense, if we assume that he refers to the whole body of culture and sentiment which, in our time, aspires to mould and direct the race apart from Christian doctrine, the answer has already been given. Christianity is, as a power in Europe, 14 centuries old. This humanitarianism is hardly a century old, but there has surely been more progress made during this last century toward the destruction of the military system, and more progress in the elimination of brutality from war than in the whole preceding 13 centuries. Does Dean Weldon doubt that, or does he regard it as a mere coincidence? Thus, whether we turn to churchman or nonconformist, to cleric or layman, we find no satisfactory apology. I have before me a short article by Mr. Max Pemberton on the question, "Will Christianity survive the war?" He uses the most consecrated phrases of the Church, and leaves no doubt whatever that he writes in defence of Christianity. But Mr. Pemberton practically confines himself to a very emphatic personal assurance that Christianity will survive the war, and does not honestly face a single one of the questions of the pagan against whom he is writing. He does make one serious point of a peculiar character. There are, he says, 23,000 priests fighting for France in the trenches. Mr. Pemberton seems to find it easy to accept the interested statements of those Roman Catholic journalists who make sectarian use of some of the London dailies. There are only about 30,000 priests in France, and since none of them are younger than 23, to suppose that 75% of them are of military age is to take a remarkable view of the population in France. In any case, there is no special ground for rhapsody. They are not volunteers. In France, every man must do his civic duty. We may appreciate their devotion to their religion on the battlefield, but Mr. Pemberton must be imperfectly acquainted with the French character if he supposes that the 34 million unbelievers of France are going to return to the church because the younger curés did not try to evade the military service which the state imposed on them. Another document I may quote is a manifesto issued by the Hampstead Evangelical Free Church Council, a joint declaration of the principal nonconformist ministers of that highly cultivated suburb. It does not purport to vindicate the churches, yet some of its observations in connection with the war open out a new page of apologetics. These clergymen invite all the citizens of their district on the grounds of the war to attend church, even if they have not been in the habit of doing so. On what more precise ground? The able lawyer who received this invitation and forwarded it to me thought it not the most ingenious but the most curious piece of pleading he had ever known. The citizens of Hampstead were invited to go to church to offer up to God a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving for his goodness to us as a nation. At the very time the eminent preachers were writing this, the darkened city still cowered under the threat of a horrible outrage. The shattered homes and fresh graves of Scarborough and Whitby reminded us faintly of the horrors beyond the sea. The maimed soldiers all over the country, the sad figures of the bereaved, the anxious hearts of 1 million of our people were but a beginning of the evil that had fallen on us. We had in 14 years since the last war been obliged to spend 1,000 millions sterling in preparation for a war we did not desire, and we were entering upon an expenditure of something more than 1,000 millions in a year. All this we had incurred through no fault of ours, and these clergymen thought it a good opportunity to invite us to go to church to thank God for his goodness to us as a nation. Another manifesto is signed by a body of archbishops and bishops of the Anglican Church. It enjoined all the faithful to supplicate the Almighty on January the 3rd to stop the war. This was to be done all round the empire. I will not indulge in any cheap sarcasm as to the result, though one would probably be right in saying that if the end be deferred to the year 1917, they will still believe that their prayers had effect. What it is more material to notice is that the prelates think that these are days of great spiritual opportunity. It seems that the shattering of so much that seemed established reveals the vanity of human affairs, and that anxiety, separation, and loss have made many hearts sensible of the approach of Christ to the soul. It is perhaps unkind to examine this emotional language from an intellectual point of view, but one feels that there is a subtle element of apology in it. These spiritual advantages may outweigh the secular pain, may even justify God's share in the great catastrophe. I have examined and will discuss more fully in the next chapter the theistic side of this plea. Intellectually, it borders on monstrosity. It is the survival of an ancient and barbaric conception. The notion that the approach of Christ to the soul is felt especially in time of affliction is merely a statement of a certain type of emotional experience, while the revelation of the vanity of human affairs is sheer perversity. Human affairs have for ages been so badly managed in this respect that we cannot in a decade or a century rid ourselves of such a legacy. The real moral is to discover who were responsible for that legacy of disorder and violence, and to put our affairs on a new and sounder basis. A considerable number of clerical writers proceed on the suggestion discreetly advanced by these Anglican prelates. Let us wait, they ask, until the clouds of war have rolled away, and then estimate the spiritual gain to men from the trial through which they have passed, and the closer association of the churches which it may bring about. Now I have no doubt that many who really believe the doctrines of Christianity, yet have for years neglected the duties which their belief imposes on them, will be induced by this awful experience to return to allegiance. The number is limited, and an equal or greater number may be, and probably will be, induced to surrender religion entirely and with good reason by the reflections with which this war inspires them. But to insinuate that this spiritual advantage, if it be an advantage of the few, is justly purchased by the appalling suffering and disorder brought about by the war, is one of those religious affirmations which seem to the outsider positively repulsive. I do not speak merely of the deaths, the pain, the privation, the outrages, the flood of tears and blood over half of Europe. This, indeed, is of itself enough to make the theory repellent to any who do not share the ascetic views taught in the churches. The notion that an evil is justified if good issue from it is akin to the notion that the end justifies the means, but I would draw attention to an aspect of the war which is almost ignored by these eloquent preachers. They eagerly record every flash of heroism, every spark of charity and mercy that the war evokes. They refer sympathetically to the dead and the bereaved, the outraged girls and women, whom in the narrowest Puritanism they forbid to rid themselves of the awful burden laid on them by drunken brutes, the shattered homes and monuments. But there is a side of war which they must know, and it demands plain speaking. It relaxes the control of moral restraints even where it was before operative. The illegitimate birth rate of England and France will faintly tell the story before the year is out. Inquiry in any town where our soldiers are lodged, or in the rear of the French and English or any other trenches, will tell it more fully. I do not speak of crime and violence, but of willing sexual intercourse where it was never known before. These things, and the increased drunkenness and the stirring of old passions, are regarded by the clergy as amongst the most evil things of life. Do they seriously suggest that they have been brought in to secure, or are justified by, the spiritual advantage of the refined and emotional few whose religion is only deepened by affliction? In short, I find not a single phrase of valid explanation or apology in these and other prominent clerical pronouncements I have read. They are superficial, contradictory, and vapid. Nothing is more common than for religious writers to protest that the conception of reality which is opposed to theirs is shallow. What depth, what sincere grip of reality does one find in any of these pulpit utterances? Yet I have taken the pronouncements of official bodies or of distinguished preachers who may be trusted to put the Christian feeling in its most persuasive form. One thinks that God sent the war, another attributes it to German rebels against God. One regards it as a spiritual agency devised for our good, another says that it is an unmitigated calamity sent for our punishment. One sees in it the failure of Christianity, others find in it precisely a confirmation of Christian teaching. Some think it will draw men to God, others that it will drive men from God. Unity perhaps we cannot expect, but the empty rhetoric and utter sophistry of most of these utterances reveal the complete lack of defence. On the main indictment of the Christian Church, its failure to have condemned and removed militarism long ago, all are silent, or the one preacher who notices it can only dejectedly confess that it is true. End of The War and the Churches by Joseph McCabe.
War Letters from a Young Queenslander by Dr. Robert Marshall Allen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ypres, Belgium, the Valley of the Shadow. 6th of May, 1915. The past fortnight has been a very strenuous one. and it was impossible for me to write fully to you during that time. Even now we are under orders to move up after one day's rest, and it is very hard on the men. It would probably be better if I gave you my experience straight from my diary, first of all telling you why we were suddenly moved up into Belgium. As you will have read, the Germans used gas on the French and forced them to retire, leaving our left flank unprotected. This was composed of Canadians, and they fought magnificently, but had to retire to keep in line with the others. At any time the salient at Ypres was pretty acute, and by this considerable success the Germans gave us an extra bulge. To hold them up and try to force them back, large reinforcements were sent up. So we who had just come up to the reserve billets in our own area suddenly got orders to do a forced march. The whole division, roughly 16,000 men, began the long trek at midday on the 24th. We marched on and on through new country, and eventually at 1 a.m. reached our billets, dead beat and footsore, and rain falling. We were off again at 7 a.m., and it was hard work. By this time we had left the flat country which had been our lot for so many months, and we were in quite hilly parts on the Belgian frontier. But we were not in the mood for going into raptures over scenery. However, one could not help noticing that the farms were more substantial and cleaner, and that there was an air of prosperity quite foreign to our own part of the line. At midday we reached a lot of huts in a field, and here we stopped until the following day. The men were dead beat and needed a rest. I got little chance of repose, as I had a foot parade, and was busy getting the men patched up, as we were going into action the following day. That evening we had an open-air service, and it was good to hear the old 100th sung in the familiar Scotch accents. The guns were making a great noise all night. 26th of April. At 6 a.m, after getting loaded up with extra ammunition, and discarding all transport, we pushed off, still not knowing what lay in front of us. After passing through a small town, we got to the outskirts of Ypres. That old town is a terrible example of what artillery fire can do. Everything in ruins, and still they are bombarding it. But we hadn't much time to worry about it. Just before we reached it, we were told of casualties in the battalions ahead of us. Each battalion spread out as much as possible, and hugged the hedges all the time. Later on we learnt that this was the only road out of the town, and that the Germans had its range to an inch, especially the pontoon bridge over the canal. On we went, blissfully ignorant of all this, until with a roar a Jack Johnson landed about 50 yards to one side. We passed many dead horses and several poor men. We got out of Ypres as fast as possible, and had several more shells near us. Our objective was a small village on a hill, about 1.5 miles out, and near it we ran into a lot of shrapnel. I got one bit on the head, but it did no damage. But I did sprint near the end and dive into a ditch. It fairly winded me. The battalion now laid down in a field in the open. Behind and in front of us were batteries. The Germans opened fire, and soon shrapnel and coal boxes were sailing over us, but luckily doing no damage. Coming up that road from Ypres, every battalion lost men. Ours was slight, only 2. We lay in this field from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Meanwhile the officers gathered in a Jack Johnson's hole, and we had the orders read out, and I arranged about an aid post. At 2 p.m. our guns had half an hour's bombardment, followed by 5 minutes rapid fire. As you can imagine, the noise was pretty bad. Then our men advanced in open formation. The German shrapnel came over in dozens, and the fields were hidden often in clouds of smoke. Big shells fell too among the men, and big and little ones came over behind to where the batteries were. Meanwhile I had gone down into a valley and chosen a post. Thank goodness I did not stay there long, but advanced up to the village to be nearer my men, for later on that spot was an inferno. Just prior to the attack I had given out baking soda to each man to use on his wet handkerchief against the gases which are used in this sector. While all fire was being directed on the advancing troops, I managed to fix up my aid post. We got to the end house, an estaminet or inn. It had previously been used by the Canadians. A big new house on the opposite side partially sheltered us from the trenches. The first thing was to look for a dugout. We used a cellar which was only partially underground, but that had to do, though I knew full well that one good hit and the house would have fallen in on us all. As there was nothing more to do until the cases were brought in, we just cleaned up the place and got ready. There were 2 rooms in front which we used for cases. I slept in the cellar, and behind we had a kitchen and some outhouses. The inn had a loft above these rooms, and then a tile roof. Not much protection if a shell burst through. At the other end of the village, about 150 yards off, was a crossroad and a church. The Germans landed shells on this spot with absolute precision. Between that corner and my place were houses, and 2 field ambulances had dressing stations in them. We were on undulating land between two ridges, about 4 miles or so apart. From the end of the house you could see where the Germans were, and also watch our men advancing in the open. So much for the general lie of the land. I had proposed going on past this village, and the chance of being blown up, to a farm a little further on, but 3 other men were there. Later events proved the wisdom of this. It was impossible to receive wounded during the day, and the rush did not come until night. I got men of every regiment, just anybody who wandered along the roads. I was up all night, and what a row was on. Shells came across every minute, and one heard rifle fire and Maxims all the time. At 5 a.m. it was dead quiet, and what a relief, though it did not last long. 27th of April. At 7 a.m. I managed to lie down on a heap of potatoes, and soon was sound asleep, being dead beat after the marches and my night's work. Even the heavy bombardment did not disturb me. The Highland infantry began to advance, and I went upstairs for a time to watch them with my glasses. This is the time when one feels an awful rotter, sitting in comparative safety, while others are advancing over open ground with shrapnel and big shells simply pouring over them. It was a fine sight to see the Jocks advance, though now and then a figure would be bowled over. Meanwhile we got our share. The house opposite was hit fair and square and a big hole made, and my outhouses were damaged. I got all my cases down into the cellar. I now saw the advantage of being at the far end of the village, for the Germans systematically shelled the crossroads and the church and surrounding houses. They were not far from me, but apparently the range was not altered. These crossroads had some trophies, dead horses, 2 motor cars, and today a brigadier general. It was absolutely unsafe to pass by except at a gallop. 28th of April. The bombardment continued, especially of the crossroads and houses. One field ambulance cleared out, and the other had to take to its cellars, with the house in ruins over it. And I have had to look on and wonder when my turn is coming, for the intervals between us is only 50 yards. The French made an attack on our left, but it came to nothing owing to gas being used again. It was a light day for me, as our men were not attacking. During the day one sees no traffic on the roads, simply a few motorcycle riders tearing along at full speed, and also ammunition limbers coming up with fresh supplies. At night up come the ration parties, and they all stop in front of my place. The wounded are evacuated day and night, though if the shelling is bad, only at night. It is wonderful how these Red Cross cars dash along the roads and come so far up in broad daylight. They are a brave lot. 29th of April. There was the usual high explosive demonstration against the batteries in the early morning, with little appreciable result. So far I have not told you about those batteries. After the Canadians retreated, this battery took up its present position. It is composed of 18-pounders, 3.3 inch. A good field gun, but not of the weight required to put out of action the heavy metal the Germans have brought up. They lie about 100 yards behind me, and also in neighbouring fields. When we arrived they had fired about 11,000 rounds, and since then they have been hard at it day and night. One gets used to the bark of an 18-pounder, though it is not pleasant. But I take off my hat to the No. 10 Canadian battery. They are our only support, and the Germans have got their range and send over all sorts of big stuff. German gunnery is good, but they have been aided by spies, several of whom were caught today. With all this continued bombardment one is getting a bit pessimistic. Where are our heavy guns? Where are our reserves? And where are our aeroplanes? Today we had no less than 4 Taubes over us, dropping smoke bombs, and of course followed by a heavy bombardment. We got our revenge on one. He came low down, and the whole line of our men opened with rifle fire and brought him down. But the Germans did not let us keep the plane, for by shell fire they wrecked it. In the afternoon the village was very heavily shelled, and towards evening the church and one of the houses caught fire, and we had a big blaze. The Germans used this as a target and plugged more shells over. The hospitals were heavily shelled also, and they were abandoned later that evening. Now I am the sole occupant of the village, and a poor honour it is, to be sure. Some of my men went up to the abandoned hospitals and brought down stores for us. We found 2 dead men and gave them a decent burial. In the fields nearby are some cows. We have collared one, and so have fresh milk. 2 pigs wander about, and really they lead a charmed life, for nothing ever hits them. I hope to continue this when we reach our next billet. They gave us 1 day's rest, and now we are moving up in support of our own sector. Truly, life is anything but a bed of roses just now. 30th of April. Another heavy bombardment of the fields behind us, though the village was left alone. Some of the hits were very close to us. All through my letter I have mentioned a heavy bombardment, but you can have little idea of what exactly it means. All this week we have been overwhelmed by the German artillery. They have turned the tables on us in revenge for Neuve Chapelle. What a variety of shots come over from 3 different directions. First of all we had the Ypres Express, the big 17-inch shells going straight on to that town. They made a big noise, but that was nothing. Next in size were the Jack Johnsons, or coal boxes. These whirred over us all day long, and when they burst, sent up an enormous cloud of dense black smoke. In addition, they left some holes in the ground. Ordinary shrapnel with its fleecy clouds was very common. Then there was the whiz-bang or pipsqueak. This shell, unlike the others, gave you no notice of its approach. All you heard was a sudden phew bang. It was very local in its action. The most terrifying, though, was a rather mysterious shell. It sounded like one, but gave 3 explosions, and I could never be sure whether it was one shell or a series of 3. But the explosion fairly sounded. It was like promp, 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 and usually immediately after it came some shrapnel. In addition, we had plenty of ordinary lyddite. During the whole week we never had more than 1 hour without shells coming over. At one period we had 48 hours continuous fire. My house simply shook like a leaf at times from the explosions, and once I was knocked down by the air from a shell. It felt just like an iron hand pushing me over. As you can well imagine, one did not feel exactly happy with all this fire. The batteries were only just behind me, and one never knew when a shot just a bit short might get us. However, I had to stay on and risk it. During the evening the artillery fire was worse than on any previous night, and 3 farms and some houses nearby were burning. 1st of May. At 9 a.m. I got a message to come and see the OC in the trenches. Off I went across country right up to our second line. I did not feel too brave going over those fields in broad daylight in full view of the Germans, but beyond getting some shrapnel over me nothing happened. The fields were simply riddled with holes, big and little. Many of them had a curious little trough at one side, where apparently the shell had entered before exploding. The appearance of the hole may be described as an oval, with a small projecting lip at one end where the shell entered. The men were all dug in, and I saw the OC in his dugout. However, I am not very keen on wandering over a battlefield just between attacks in daylight. That afternoon our men attacked, and made a magnificent charge, but we had to stop short. But it was grand to watch our men going on. Of course the aftermath came when I got the wounded in. I shall always remember that night. I was hard at it from 7 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. without stopping. Cases poured in, and soon I had every room full, and all the outhouses, and even outside. Outside it was fair hell. Shells were coming over in dozens. The houses near me were on fire. My own place was hit, and next morning I found that one shell had landed in the backyard. But I was too busy to notice any of this. By the dim light of 2 candles I was bending over stretcher cases and wading through field dressings. At the end I could hardly stand, I was so dead beat. I managed to get them all safely away at 5 a.m, and then we packed up as the regiment had left some hours previously. With another medical man equally tired, I walked down over part of the battlefield and then through Ypres. It was dead calm, and we got away safely. But what a number of dead horses were lying about, and some poor fellows too. The stench was something awful. I should liken this road from the outskirts of Ypres up to where I was, to the valley of the shadow of death. The Germans had its range, and woe betide the wayfarer. One had to rush through it at any time, and the odds were against him. It consisted of ruined houses and great holes in the road, and wrecked transport and dead horses, and poor drivers too. And yet that Sunday morning, as we passed the worst spot, at the pontoon bridge over the canal, we heard music from one house. A few Tommies wandering back were going through the houses looking for anything, and chancing on a piano were strumming a comic song. Truly, Thomas Atkins is a wonderful being. I was dead beat when I got back to the regiment, but I had more work to do. However, I had done my best under conditions which, to say the least, were not very pleasant or healthy, and the reward I got was very heartening. The colonel of the field ambulance, to whom my cases had gone, sent me a message saying that my cases were the best dressed he had ever seen, and he congratulated me on them. They were all sent on at once to the train. Our padre was also there, and he said that our men looked quite different from those of other regiments, and that they were all very grateful for what we had done. My own colonel and the officers of the regiment were very pleased at this also. Don't think that I am boasting in mentioning all this, but I had a terrible week, such as you cannot imagine, and was lucky to come out safe, and the last night was no joke. But when I heard that praise, I had a feeling that there are rewards, not tangible, but just as precious, which a doctor only can get. I did my best, and that was all about it, for I couldn't have done anything else. 10th of May, 1915. I did not meet with any gas cases, for we did not have much in front of us. The regiments nearby suffered severely. One hardly need waste space complaining of such methods. We shall just have to lick them by similar means if ordered to do so, or by sternly fighting on. Apparently chlorine is the gas most in use, though other gases are emitted also. The great thing we have to do is to reassure the men. They don't mind ordinary warfare, but this is something unknown. The gas can, of course, be seen by day, and at night a hissing sound betrays its issue from the pipes. Until the men get respirators, the only thing to do is to retire from the trenches, and then to charge back through it when the fumes have dissipated a bit. Hand bombs will help to break up the fumes also. The chemical means of getting rid of it are solution of hypo, used in clearing and fixing photographic negatives, and washing soda. These are now supplied to the troops. The effects on the men are simply devilish, and it does make one's blood boil to have to stand by and be of such little use. We shall make them pay up for all this later. Another thought which strikes me is the comparative inefficiency of a large part of all artillery bombardments. We probably went through a week of more concentrated fire than any troops ever did, yet 99% of the shots went into earth and did no material damage. The fields certainly were simply pitted, but beyond that little damage was done. It made one rather feel that after all, if a shell was going to hit you it would, despite what precautions you took, and that in the meantime you could go on with your work and disregard them. I was very amused one afternoon watching a lot of our men chasing some cows over the fields with their canteens amid quite a respectable amount of shrapnel. Our journey back to the old spots was uneventful, though very fatiguing. All marches have to be done by night, and it is hard to keep going. I was getting quite an expert at walking along practically asleep. We found that some mouth organs were a great help to make us forget the never-ending kilometres. After resting a day, we were warned for another great attack now on, and weary though we are, the men were keen to get a bit of their own back. That battle is now raging, and more I cannot say yet. Yesterday the General came to us and read out Smith-Dorrien's thanks to the Lahore Division. It confirmed what I had thought about the whole business. When the Germans broke through they seriously threatened Ypres, and if they had got over the canal banks would have cut off a large number of our men and compelled them to surrender. We were rushed up, and to quote the Second Army's commander's words, without adequate artillery preparation and against an overwhelming artillery, maxim and rifle fire, together with a glacis position and poisonous gases, you stopped further progress. While only partially successful in attacking them, you prevented any advance and enabled the lines to be rearranged, and thus, in spite of heavy casualties, saved your comrades. This is something to be proud of, and I am glad I was in such an action. We had terrible losses, but we did what was wanted and prevented any possible sedan occurring. Today I was ordered to return to my old field ambulance. I wanted to remain with the regiment, but ever since I left the Colonel has been trying to get me back. I should be pleased to be considered worth having. The ambulance has had to give up all its regular officers to other units lately, and there were a lot of new chums who had never heard a gun fired, so naturally, as a veteran, I was wanted. The Colonel was good enough to say that he looked on me as his right-hand man. I am acting second in command now, and specialist in advanced operative surgery, besides looking after the transport. All of which are honorary, but I feel that I have been of some use up at the front, and that means a lot. I am giving my best all the time. 15th of May, 1915. Referring to some letters received from Brisbane. The nurses you refer to, and as many more Australian nurses as possible, will be very welcome here. I read lately that many of them had been rejected by the War Office regulation refusing to recognise them unless from hospitals of over 100 beds. But we need every nurse available, for already amateurs with only a few months' training are being sent out. I need hardly say that I feel pleased that my letters are of such interest. One is often tired when writing, but it is cheering to know that they are appreciated. By this time you will be getting full details of the Dardanelles, and Australia has cause to be proud of the way her boys went ashore. It was different from our warfare, but the same old spirit shows forth. Referring to the destruction by gas of prickly pear. It is a pity we could not have some of that arsenical preparation for prickly pear to use on the Huns. Since last writing, the measures we have taken against chlorine gas have been very successful. The men have waited while the fumes passed by, and then fired on the advancing Germans. The pads, or respirators, are soaked in a solution of thiosulphate of soda, hypo. For the last week this ambulance has been doing nothing, and time has hung heavy on our hands. But the fight has been going on steadily, and the loss of life has been something appalling. For over a week now 3 fights have been going on. To our north, at Ypres, the struggle still continues. After we came back, new troops came up, and the fight became even more desperate. The Germans have been pushing us back very slowly, and it would not surprise me if the town fell. But then we would have a straightened line and a better position. Meanwhile, the French just below our line have made a very marked progress, and still are pushing on. Last weekend we made an attack here, and I rather think it was meant to be an elaborate feint to relieve the French and the British at Ypres. Of course we would have gone on if successful. This part of the line is very strongly protected, and our attack did not succeed. The Germans retired during the preliminary bombardment to dugouts, or rather subterranean passages reinforced by concrete and practically shell-proof. When our men advanced, they came back to the mined first-line trenches. It was the same old tale of British doggedness against a withering fire, but we were held up. I wish the slackers at home could only see how our blood is being poured out here for them. If they could only see the barbed wire thick with corpses, or rows of men mown down by Maxim fire, perhaps then they would come out and help us. The plain truth of the fighting recently is that instead of pushing the Germans, we are being put to our utmost to hold them in. Don't think I am despondent, but when one has been battered about as I was recently, it certainly destroys any optimistic feelings. As I write, the big guns are thundering out again preparatory to another attack, and this one we hope will be successful. The country is looking very well just now. The trees have become covered with leaves, and the hawthorn blooms under a blue sky. Flanders looks pretty, and what a contrast to the winter. But within 3 miles of here, thousands of corpses lie unburied, and more are added to them daily. The grim harvest is still being gathered in, and there are many more days to go. 20th of May, 1915. We are still resting and doing nothing, though our men are not remaining so quiescent. At the beginning of the week the Indian troops kept the Huns busy opposite here, while the 7th Division swooped in on them lower down and made a great advance. But as usual our luck with the weather was dead out. The wind always blows towards us, or else fog and rain come on, and the latter occurred this time. The attack rather took the Germans by surprise. The artillery fire was very heavy, and from prisoners we heard it was very successful. It was so intense that the ration wagons could not come up to the trenches, and for 24 hours the Germans were without food. The men who surrendered were a very weedy lot, quite different from the usual. But all who desired to give themselves up did not manage to do so. One lot were spotted by their own side, who promptly began to fire on them. As we could not get them, we put our artillery on them also, and between the two fires not a man remained. The guards also came to a lot who put up their hands, but to no avail. Our men simply wiped them out, and refused to be held back by their officers. One cannot blame them after what the Germans have done to our men, especially the wounded. A Prussian officer was being led back under escort near here, and made some offensive remark to his escort, who promptly bayoneted him on the spot. The last 3 weeks have been an orgy of slaughter, but one has got used to that now. We only think in thousands as regards casualties. The methods of the Germans have so aroused our men that nothing will hold them in. They are exacting a tribute from the Huns for all their misdeeds. In the last advance the Germans had no gas cylinders, though they used asphyxiating bombs, but probably after this enforced halt they have brought up the gas. However, with our masks and helmets we are prepared for them. So far we have not used any gas ourselves, but it is not because we have any squeamish feelings. The losses we sustained were comparatively slight in the attack, much less than we expected, and the Germans are said to have lost 10,000. For a fortnight now they have had reverses all along the western line, and their losses must have been enormous. But we haven't taken the fight out of them yet by a long way. We know that their 1915 class has been called up, and is being used, and we hope that soon the terrible drain will tell on them. Meanwhile we are being faced, like you, with a serious shortage of water. There are so many men concentrated in a small area that most of the wells are running dry. Probably we shall have to drink canal water before long. As it is, water for animals and washing purposes is taken entirely from the ditches. As we advance the problem will increase, for we may be sure that all the wells will be poisoned. The old grandmothers, the 15-inch howitzers, have been busy lately, with good results. One old lady was told off to obliterate a certain town. The first shot went 500 yards wide, much to the gunners' disgust. The next day the General congratulated them on their work, and said that this shot had absolutely wiped out a German battery. Round this same gun were 3 houses. When the first shot was fired, one house collapsed, and the others were speedily evacuated. Since Ypres, one is inclined to forget that there are any dangers about here, but a couple of incidents have soon given us a reminder. A close friend of mine, and an old pupil at the Rotunda, has just died of his wounds. He was with his regiment near me at Ypres. The man who replaced me with the Highland infantry had a narrow escape on his first day. A piece of shrapnel went through his cap, and another gave him a nasty bruise on the side. His orderly was killed by his side. The Highland Light Infantry are a very unlucky regiment for medical officers, and I got out well for the period I was with them. My days up at the trenches are numbered at present. The Colonel is keeping me at headquarters to run the show, and the other fellows go out. It is a compliment, and one should be satisfied. But one is always hankering for the more exciting visits to the aid posts. However, any day may bring a surprise, and one really does not know what is in the future. End of War Letters from a Young Queenslander by Dr. Robert Marshall Allen. Read by Dr. Beth Thomas.
The Kaiser by A.G. Gardner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter from A.G. Gardner's book, Prophets, Priests and Kings, published in April 1914. The Kaiser. When I think of the Kaiser, I think of a bright May morning at Potsdam. It is the spring parade, and across from where we are gathered under the windows of the old palace, the household troops are drawn up on the great parade ground, their helmets and banners and lances all astir in the jolly sunshine. Officers gallop hither and thither, shouting their commands. Regiments form and reform. Swords flash out and flash back again. A noble background of trees frames the gay picture with cool green foliage. There is a sudden stillness. The closely serried ranks are rigid and moveless. The shouts of command are silenced. The Kaiser! He comes slowly up the parade ground on his great white charger, helmet and eagle flashing in the sunlight, sitting his horse as if he lived in the saddle, his face turned to his men as he passes by. Morgen, meine Kinder! His salutation rings out at intervals in the clear morning air, and back from the ranks in chorus comes the response, Morgen, Majestat! And as he rides on, master of 1,000,000 men, the most powerful figure in Europe, reviewing his troops on the peaceful parade ground at Potsdam, one wonders whether the day will ever come when he will ride down those ranks on another errand, and when that cheerful response of the soldiers will have in it the ancient ring of doom, Te morituri salutamus. For answer, let us look at this challenging figure on the white charger. What is he? What has he done? The Kaiser is easily the foremost man in Europe. He is a king after Charles I's own heart, a king indeed, the last that is left, the residuary legatee of the divine right. The divinity of the Tsar vanished in the tumult of Red Sunday. He is an autocrat struggling with an infuriated people. His power frankly rests on physical force. But the Kaiser is still able to associate Providence with his rule, still invokes the Almighty as the witness of his authority. Democracy, which has devoured all the rest, thunders at the base of his throne. It leaps higher and ever higher. One day there will come a wave that will submerge all, and divine right will have passed forever from kings to peoples. Then the Kaiser will rule by consent, like our own monarch, or... Meanwhile he stands, facing the modern world, the symbol of medievalism in the heart of the 20th century. The cause for which he fights could have no more worthy protagonist. He is every inch a king. Divest him of his office, and he would still be one of the 6 most considerable men in his empire. When the British editors visited Germany, they were brought into intimate contact with all the leaders of action and thought in the country, and I believe it is true to say that the Kaiser left the sharpest and most vivid personal impression on the mind. It was the impression of enormous energy and mental alertness, of power wayward and uncertain, but fused with a spark of genius, of a temperament of high nervous force, quickly responsive to every emotional appeal. His laugh is as careless as a boy's, but you feel that it is laughter that may turn to lightning at a word. The world distrusts the artistic temperament in affairs. It prefers the stolid man, who thinks slowly and securely and acts with deliberation. It likes a man whose mental processes it can follow and understand, a man of the type of the late Duke of Devonshire, solid, substantial, and not the least bit clever. There is the root of the disquiet with which the Kaiser has been regarded for 20 years. He is a man of moods and impulses, an artist to his fingertips, astonishingly versatile, restless, and unnerving. He keeps his audience in a state of tense expectation. At any moment it feels a spark from this incandescent personality may drop into the powder magazine. He is full of dramatic surprises, of sudden and shattering entrances, of mysterious exits. He moves amidst alarums and excursions, and wherever he goes the limelight follows him. He journeys to Tangier, and Europe trembles at the thunder of his tread. He sails away into Arctic seas on a summer cruise, and his astonishing sermons to his men echo round the world. He comes back and makes our flesh creep with his pictured visions of the Yellow Peril. He writes an opera, and is off to the Rhine to wind his horn. He addresses public meetings like a party politician, and with the authority of a prophet, he denounces the socialists like a Property Defence League orator. No man in history ever had a more godlike vision of himself than he has. His cloud of dignity is held from falling by the visible hand of the Almighty. I regard my whole position, he tells the representatives of Brandenburg, as given to me direct from heaven, and that I have been called by the Highest to do his work. Sometimes, indeed, even the Almighty is subordinate. Suprema lex regis voluntas, he writes in the Golden Book of Munich. He declares his omnipotence, with a childish egoism that would be ludicrous if it were not so sincere. He takes nothing for granted, does not, like Montaigne, let his chateau speak for him. My church, of which I am summus episcopus, he says in lecturing the office-bearers on their duties. And again, there is only one master in this country, that am I. Who opposes me, I shall crush to pieces. It is like the vain prattle of an unschooled boy. His uncle dwells aloof from politics. The Kaiser comes down into the arena like a stump orator. To me, he said in 1889, every social democrat is synonymous with the enemy of the nation and of the fatherland. This to the largest party in the land, a party that commands 3.5 million votes, and years have not taught him discretion. At Breslau, not long ago, in addressing a deputation of working men, he said, "For years you and your brothers in Germany have allowed yourselves to be kept by socialist agitators under the delusion that if you do not belong to their party, you will not be in position to obtain a hearing for your legitimate interests. That is a downright lie. With such men you cannot, you dare not, as men who love honour, have anything more to do. You cannot, you dare not, let yourselves be guided by them any longer." Diplomacy and restraint, it will be seen, are not among his varied gifts in dealing with his people. Sometimes his vaulting ambition o'erleaps itself. It was his dearest wish to be not German emperor, but Emperor of Germany, and crowned as such. He designed all the splendours of the ceremony, taking Charlemagne as his prototype, but he found there were limits to the complaisance of the other German rulers and peoples, always intensely jealous of the dominance of Prussia and its king. They would not yield, and he remains today the uncrowned German emperor, not the crowned Emperor of Germany. It is the fly in the imperial ointment, the supreme disappointment of his career. Bismarck had cared only for the substance and not for the shadow when he consented to the limited title of the ruler of the new empire. The subject was being discussed in his presence at the time of the Union. Some were for German emperor, and some for Emperor of Germany. "Does anyone know the Latin word for sausage?" asked Bismarck, using that homely imagery of his. "Farcimentum," said one. "Farcimen," said another. Farcimentum or farcimen, it is all the same to me, said Bismarck. Sausage was sausage, whatever the name. He had welded Germany and was indifferent to titles. The Kaiser's view of his divine function extends to every phase of life. There is nothing in which he cannot instruct his people. He will snatch the baton from the incompetent conductor and show him how to lead the orchestra, the brush from the incompetent artist and show him how to paint. He can cook a dinner as skillfully as he can preach a sermon, draw a cartoon, write an opera, play the piano, or talk in 5 languages. And who will forget his amazing letter to Admiral Holman on the higher criticism in reply to Professor Delitzsch? Even trade does not escape him, and the famous pottery works which he has founded and carries on at Kardenen are a source of delighted labour to him. He has established a shop in Berlin to dispose of his wares, and he will take an order on the cuff of his shirt-sleeve with the promptness of a commercial traveller. But all this is the recreation of his strenuous life. His serious task is to make Germany great. The ambition with which he set out was to create a navy. He has done it. Frederick taught Germany to march. He has taught it to swim. Navigare necesse est, vivere non est necesse. And if he regards his people as children, he is anxious that they should be efficient children. His views on education are entirely radical, and not very sympathetic towards the meticulous and exact scholarship which is Germany's contribution to the modern world. Our business is to educate young Germans, not young Greeks and Romans, he says. He approves of Homer, that glorious man about whom I have always been enthusiastic, and of Cicero and Demosthenes, whose speeches must have filled everyone with delight. But he has no sympathy with grammatical and fanatical philologists, who waste their own time and the time of students over grammatical hair-splitting. Away with this tomfoolery, war to the knife against such teaching. He will have no rival near the throne. Does the mighty figure of Bismarck tower to the heavens and divide the crown? Then Bismarck must go back to his fields and woodlands at Friedrichsruhe. He will brook no interference, tolerate no counsel. He is here to command, not to take advice. And yet the revelations of the Moltke trial have shown that the most omnipotent of emperors is subject to the subtlest and most insidious of influences. Men used to talk of him in whispers in Germany, or they did not talk of him at all, for lèse-majesté was the cardinal's sin, and walls had ears and streets had spies. But that is changed. Criticism is abroad, and the doctrine of divinity has received several checks which the Kaiser has had the wisdom to acknowledge. But he will never be a popular figure. The old emperor, his never-to-be-forgotten grandfather, was loved. There at the palace in Berlin they show you the window at which he used to sit in the mornings, to see and be seen by the crowd, an old familiar figure, human and paternal, the father of his people. His grandson is aloof and remote. He dwells on Olympus and sends his thunderbolts hurtling over the astonished people. But though he does not ask for affection, he commands respect. His people admire his character. They are proud of his clean, vigorous life, of his devotion to his family, of his high sense of duty to the fatherland. His life is a drama that never grows humdrum. It keeps them intellectually on the move. What will happen next with this amazing man? No one can be more fascinating. His smile is irresistible. But if you are a bore, or if you are out of favour, his look runs through you like a sword. His questions are rapped out like musket shots. He does not listen to your answers, but plays with his dogs. He is not aware of you. His actions are swift and unexpected. The spur of the moment drives him. It was a momentary irritation with Lord Salisbury that was the origin of the Kruger telegram, perhaps the most momentous and disastrous incident in the history of Europe in our time, for it was the seed of all the bitterness of after years. The telegram form, indeed, is the symbol of his mental processes. He will become a guest at your board at an hour's notice, and be the most light-hearted boy at the table. When he entertained the editors at luncheon, at the orangery at Sans Souci, he said nothing about seeing them. The first intimation they had was the vision, as they sat taking their coffee in the sunshine, of the Kaiser riding up the steep winding paths from the palace below, and in 2 minutes he was among them, talking of the London docks and the Hamburg docks, of the Lake District and Lord Lonsdale, with pleasant frankness and easy idiomatic English. Then, with a bright word of welcome to his country and his house, and with 3 salutes, a special mark of imperial approval, he rode away. Impulsive, imperious, dramatic, a militarist from his cradle, a statesman trained in the indirect crooked ways of Bismarck, governed by one passion, the passion to make his land great and powerful, how can we cast his horoscope? Is he a menace or a safeguard? Let his past be his witness. For 20 years he has had the peace of Europe in his keeping, and for 20 years not a German soldier has fallen in war. "We are a military people," said a minister to me in Berlin, "but we are not a warlike people. It is you who are warlike without being military." And so we may say of the Kaiser. He is a militarist, but he is not a warrior. "There will be no war without grave cause while the Kaiser is on the throne," said the politician I have quoted. He is distrusted by the warlike party, and remembers that Germany has a considerable school of thinkers who believe in war philosophically as a national purgative. They believe he is timid, but the truth is he wants peace because it is his own and the nation's chief interest. Remember how he disappointed expectation when he came to the throne. Germany was on the verge of war with France and Russia combined, and Europe saw the accession of the youthful Kaiser so hot-headed and impulsive, with fearful expectation. Here was a new Napoleon, filled with dreams of glory, armed with the most gigantic military weapon in history. And his first official words were words of peace. His first act, to visit the European courts, returning with the message, "I believe that, with the help of God, I have succeeded in ensuring the peace of the world for many years to come." Set this and the record of his reign against those sudden ebullitions that seem so alarming, but they are really only sound and fury, signifying nothing. He keeps his powder dry and his armour bright, but he stands for peace. Peace armed to the teeth, it is true, peace with the mailed fist, but peace nevertheless. And so, as one watches him riding down the ranks at Potsdam in the bright sunshine, hears the morning greeting rapped out in sharp staccato, and sees his salute to the Empress watching the parade from the windows of the old palace, one feels confidence displacing distrust, and discerns beneath all this rattle of drums and love of the drama of government an undercurrent of purpose, making, it is true, for the aggrandizement of Germany, but making also for the peace of the world. If he fails in his policy of peace, it will be because of the incurable air of falsity that is the besetting vice of German policy, a policy which has been well described by the Frankfurter Zeitung as incalculable, untrustworthy, and disturbing. It is a policy that always wears a mask, and a mask is a menace. Its words are smooth, but its acts are sinister and seem to have no relation to the words. It is a policy of cunning rather than of candour. It is incident to a government which is personal and secret, and Germany will not cease to be a disturbing element in world politics until the Kaiser has stepped down from his medieval throne and derives his power from a free and self-governing people. End of The Kaiser by A.G. Gardner.
Apostolisches Schreiben an die im Kriege sich befindenden Völker und ihre Leiter von Papst Benedikt XV. Dies ist eine LibriVox-Aufnahme. Alle LibriVox-Aufnahmen sind lizenzfrei und im öffentlichen Besitz. Weitere Informationen und Hinweise zur Beteiligung an diesem Projekt gibt es bei LibriVox.org. Nachdem wir, obgleich unwürdig, als Nachfolger des milden Papstes Pius X. auf den Thron des Apostelfürsten berufen wurden, in welchem der Schmerz über den Bruderkrieg kurz vorher entflammt, sein heiligmäßiges und wohltätiges Leben abgekürzt hat, fühlen auch wir, wenn wir unsere Blicke auf die blutgetränkten Schlachtfelder wenden, den Schmerz eines Vaters, welcher sein Haus verwüstet sieht und unbewohnbar gemacht wurde von einem verheerenden Orkan. Und denken mit unaussprechlichem Schmerz an all unsere jugendlichen Söhne, welche zu Tausenden und Abertausenden vom Tode hinweggeraubt wurden, fühlen wir in unserem Herzen, erfüllt von der Liebe Christus des Herrn, den ganzen Schmerz der Mütter und der vorzeitig verwitweten Frauen und das untröstbare Jammern der ihres Vaters zu früh beraubten Kinder. Im Geiste nehmen wir immer teil an dem Schmerz unzählbarer Familien, und wohlerkennend unserer uns gemäß unserer erhabenen Sendung auferlegten Pflicht, nämlich der Mission des Friedens und der Nächstenliebe, haben wir uns fest vorgenommen, unsere ganze Tätigkeit und unsere ganze Autorität für die Versöhnung der kriegsführenden Völker einzusetzen. Und so haben wir auch feierliche Gelübde dem göttlichen Erlöser gemacht, welcher um den Preis seines kostbaren Blutes alle Menschen, unsere Brüder, erlösen wollte. Und Worte des Friedens und der Liebe waren unsere ersten, welche wir an die Völker und Leiter derselben als oberster Seelenhirte richteten. Aber leider blieb unser Rat, liebevoll und dringend als Vater und Freund, unerhört. Und wenn sich in unserem Herzen der Schmerz vermehrte, so verminderte sich nicht unser Vorsatz, und vertrauensvoll nahmen wir unsere Zuflucht zu Gott dem Allmächtigen, welcher in seiner Hand hat sowohl die Herzen als auch die Gedanken der Untertanen und der Könige, erflehen von ihm die Beendigung des ungeheuren Unglücks. Alle Gläubigen wollten wir mit uns im inbrünstigsten Gebete vereinigen, und um die Erhörung dieses Gebetes zu erflehen, wollten wir, dasselbe vereint werde mit Ausübung einer christlichen Buße. Aber heute, an dem traurigen Jahrtage des Ausbruchs des Krieges, flehen wir umso heißer zu Gott, dass dem grausamen Kriege ein Ende gesetzt werden möge, erflehen aus ganzem Herzen den Frieden. Möge dieser unser Friedensruf das Waffengeklirr übertönen und die nun im Kriege sich befindenden Völker und ihre Leiter erreichen, damit sowohl die einen wie die anderen den milden und aufrichtig gemeinten Ratschlägen Folge leisten mögen. Im allerheiligsten Namen des Allmächtigen, unseres göttlichen Vaters, und um des kostbaren Blutes Jesu Christi willen, für die Erlösung der Menschheit vergossen, beschwören wir euch, o Herrscher der nun im Kriege sich befindlichen Völker, endlich diesem entsetzlichen Kampfe ein Ende zu bereiten, welcher seit einem Jahr Europa entehrt. Denn es ist ja Bruderblut, welches zu Wasser und zu Land vergossen wird. Die schönsten Landstriche Europas, dieses herrlichen Gartens der Welt, sind bedeckt mit Toten und angehäuft von Ruinen, wo noch vor kurzem Handel und Industrie sowie der Ackerbau blühten. Da tönen jetzt dröhnen die Geschütze, nicht verschonend Dörfer und Städte, sondern überall nur Tod und Elend säend. Ihr aber habt vor Gott und den Menschen die fürchterliche Verantwortung für Krieg und Frieden. Wir flehen euch an, erhört die väterliche Stimme des Stellvertreters, des ewigen und höchsten Richters, welchem auch ihr Rechenschaft ablegen müsst, sowohl über die öffentlichen als auch über eure privaten Taten. Die großen Reichtümer, mit welchen Gott, der Schöpfer, die eurer Leitung unterworfenen Länder ausgestattet hat, erlauben euch, den Kampf fortzusetzen. Aber um welchen Preis? Es antwortet aus den Gräbern tausend und abertausend Stimmen der jungen Männer, die täglich auf dem Schlachtfelde sterben. Es antworten die Ruinen so vieler Städte und Dörfer und Kunstwerke, welche wir der Frömmigkeit und dem Genie unserer Vorfahren verdanken. Und diese vielen bitteren Tränen, vergossen fast in jedem Heim oder zu fassen der Altäre, wiederholen nicht auch sie, dass groß ist, ja zu groß, der Preis des täglichen Kampfes? Man möge auch nicht sagen, dass der ungeheure Streit nicht ohne Waffengewalt beigelegt werden kann. Man möge von vornherein einsehen, dass die Nationen nicht sterben, und daher absehen von dem gegenseitigen Vorsatz, sich zu vernichten. Die Nationen, erniedrigt und gedemütigt, ertragen mit Widerwillen das Aufgezwungene, bereiten sich aber vor auf die Wiedereroberung und verbreiten von Geschlecht zu Geschlecht Hass und Rache. Warum nicht von nun ab mit Gerechtigkeit die rechte und gerechten Aspirationen der Völker prüfen und abwägen? Warum nicht mit frischem Mute einen direkten oder indirekten Meinungsaustausch herbeiführen, zum Zweck der Prüfung dieser Rechte oder Aspirationen, um so dem ungeheuren Krieg ein Ende zu bereiten, so wie man es auch tat in anderen ähnlichen Umständen? Gesegnet sei derjenige, welcher zuerst den Palmzweig erheben wird und seinem Feind die Rechte darbieten wird, zugleich ihm annehmbare Friedensbedingungen anbietend. Denn das Gleichgewicht in der Welt und der gedeihliche und sichere Friede der Völker beruhen hauptsächlich auf gegenseitigem Wohlwollen und auf der Hochachtung der gegenseitigen Würde und Rechte viel mehr als auf große Heere und gewaltige Festungen. Das ist der Friedensruf, der umso lauter tönt an diesem traurigen Jahrtage. Und wir laden daher alle, die Freunde des Friedens sind, ein, uns die Hand zu reichen, um das Ende des Krieges, welcher Europa in ein weites Schlachtfeld verwandelt hat, zu beschleunigen. Möge Christus, der Herr, von Mitleid bewogen, nach so fürchterlicher Plage die Morgenröte des Friedens leuchten lassen. Mögen bald zu Gott dem Herrn, dem Geber alles Guten, Dankgebete emporsteigen für die Wiederaussöhnung der Staaten. Möchten die Völker in brüderlicher Liebe vereint den edlen Wettstreit um Künste und Wissenschaften sowie des Handels wieder aufnehmen. Nachdem das Recht eines jeden wiederhergestellt ist, mögen sie sich von nun ab entschließen, Streitfragen nicht mehr dem Schwerte zur Entscheidung zu überlassen, sondern durch Recht und Gerechtigkeit mögen sie entschieden werden, nachdem dieselben mit Ruhe und Mäßigung vorher diskutiert wurden. Und das, wahrhaftig, würde eure schönste und ruhmreichste Eroberung sein. In der sicheren Hoffnung, dass durch solche Vereinbarungen bald wieder der Welt der lang ersehnte Friede gebracht werde, erteilen wir aus ganzem Herzen all denjenigen, die unserer Hirtensorge anvertraut sind, den heiligen apostolischen Segen. Und auch für diejenigen, welche nicht der heiligen römischen Kirche angehören, bitten wir den Herrn, dass er sie mit uns vereinigen möge im Geist der vollkommensten Nächstenliebe. Gegeben zu Rom im Vatikan am 28. Juli 1915. Ende von Apostolisches Schreiben an die im Kriege sich befindenden Völker und ihre Leiter von Papst Benedikt XV. Aufgenommen von Dom Bombadil.
Part 1 of Inside the Glass Doors, from a Diary Without Dates by Enid Bagnold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Diary Without Dates by Enid Bagnold. Chapter 2 Inside the Glass Doors, Part 1. My feet ache, ache, ache. End of the first day. Life in a ward is all scurry and rush. I don't reflect. I'm putting on my cap anyhow, and my hands are going to the dogs. I shall never get to understand sisters. They are so strange, so tricky, uncertain as collies. Deep down they have an ineradicable axiom that any visitor, anyone in an old musquash coat, in a high-boned collar, in a spotted veil tied up at the sides, anyone with whom one shakes hands or takes tea, is more important than the most charming patient, except, of course, a warded M.O. For this reason the mouths of the pillow-cases are all turned to face up the ward, away from the door. I think plants in a ward are a barbarism, for as they are always arranged on the table by the door, it is again obvious that they are intended only to minister to the eye of the visitor, that race of gods. In our ward there are 18 fern pots, some in copper, some in pink china, 3 in mauve paper, and 1 hanging basket of ferns. All of these have to be taken out on the landing at night and in again in the morning, and they have to be soaked under the tap. The sisters' minds are as yet too difficult for me, but in the minds of the VADs I see certain salient features. I see, already manifested in them, the ardent longing to be alike. I know and remember this longing. It was present through all my early years in a large boarding school. But there it was naturally corrected by the changes of growth and the inexpertness of youth. Here I see for the first time grown women trying with all the concentration of their fuller years to be as like one another as it is possible to be. There is a certain dreadful innocence about them, too, as though each would protest, in spite of our tasks, our often immodest tasks, our minds are as white as snow. And as far as I can see, their conception of a white female mind is the silliest, most mulish, incurious, unresponsive, condemning kind of an ideal that a human creature could set before it. At present I am so humble that I am content to do all the labor and take none of the temperatures, but I can see very well that it is when I reach a higher plane that all the trouble will begin. The ranklings, the heart-burnings, the gross injustices. Who is to make the only poultice? Who is to paint the very septic throat of Mr. Mullins, Army Service Corps? Who is to, dizzy splendor, go round with the M.O. should the sister be off for a half-day? These and other questions will form the pride and anguish of my inner life. It is wonderful to go up to London and dine and stay the night with Madeline after the hospital. The hospital, a sort of monotone, a place of whispers and wheels moving on rubber tires, long corridors, and strangely unsexed women moving in them. Unsexed, not in any real sense, but the white clothes, the hidden hair, the stern white collar just below the chin, give them an air of school-girlishness, an air and a look women don't wear in the world. They seem unexpectant. Then, at Madeline's, the light, the talk, the deep bath got ready for me by a maid, instead of my getting it ready for a patient. Not that I mind getting it ready. I like it. Only the change. It's like being turn and turn about, maid and mistress. There is the first snow here, scanty and frozen on the doorstep. I came home last night in the dark to dinner, and found its faint traces on the road and in the gutter as I climbed the hill. I couldn't see well. There were stars, but no moon. Higher up it was unmistakable, long white tracks frozen in the dried mud of the road, and a branch under a lamp thickened with frozen snow. Shall I ever grow out of that excitement over the first bit of snow? I felt a glow of pride in the hill, thinking, in London it's all slush and mud. They don't suspect what we've got here. A suburb is a wonderful place. After a wet and muddy day in London, I've seen the trains pull into Charing Cross with snow piled on the roofs of the carriages, and felt a foot taller for joy that I was one of those fortunates who might step into a train and go down into a white countryside. It is the same excitement to wake up early to an overnight fall and see down the Dover road for miles no foot of man printed, but only the birds' feet. Considering the Dover road has been a highway since the Romans, it really is a fine moment when you realize its surface has suddenly become untrodden and unexplored as any jungle. Alas, the amount of snow that has set me writing! 2 bucketfuls in the whole garden. When a medical officer goes sick, or, in other words, when an M.O. is warded, a very special and almost cynical expression settles on his face. Also, the bedside manner of the visiting officer is discarded as he reaches the bed of the sick M.O. "My knees are very painful," says the sick M.O. but it is a despondent statement, not a plea for aid. The visiting officer nods, but he does not suggest that they will soon be better. They look at each other as weak human beings look, and "We might try," says the visiting officer questioningly. The M.O. agrees without conviction, and settles back on his pillows. Not for him the comfortable trust in the divine knowledge of specialists. He can endure like a dog, but without its faith in its master. The particular M.O. whose knees are painful is, as a matter of fact, better now. He got up yesterday. Mooning about the ward in a dressing-gown, he stared first out of one window into the fog, and then out of another. Finally, just before he got back into bed, he made an epigram. "Nurse," he said, "the difference between being in bed and getting up is that in bed you do nothing, but when you get up there's nothing to do." I tucked him up and put the cradle over his knees, and he added, "One gets accustomed to everything," and settled back happily with his reading lamp, his French novel, and his dictionary. The fog developed all day yesterday, piling up white and motionless against the window panes. As night fell, a little air of excitement ran here and there amongst the V.A.D.s. "How shall we get home? Are the buses running? Oh no, the last one is stuck against the railings outside. My torch has run out." By 7 o'clock even the long corridor was as dim as the alley outside. No one thought of shutting the windows. I doubt whether they will shut. And the fog rolled over the sill in banks and round the open glass doors till even the white cap of a sister could hardly be seen as she passed. I am pleased with any atmospheric exaggeration. The adventure of going home was before me. At 8 I felt my way down over the steps into the alley. The torch, held low on the ground, lighted but a small pale circle round my shoes. Outside it was black and solid and strangely quiet. In the yard a man here and there raised his voice in a shout. Feet strayed near mine and edged away. At the crossroads I came on a lantern standing upon the ground, and by it drooped the nose of a benighted horse. The spurt of a match lit the face of its owner. Up the hill the torch held low against the curbstone. The sudden looming of a black giant made me start back, as I nearly ran my head into a telegraph post. I was at the bottom of the sea. Fathoms and fathoms of fog must stand above my head. Suddenly a dozen lights showed about me, then the whole sky alight with stars, and naked trees with the rime on them bristling. The long road ran up the hill, its accustomed steel color. The old post office was there with its red window, the lean old lamp post with its broken arm. I had walked out of the fog as one walks out of the sea onto a beach. Looking back, I could see the pit behind me, the fog standing on the road like a solid wall, straight up and down. Again I felt a pride in the hill. Down there, I thought, those groping feet and shouting voices, that man and that horse, they don't guess. I walked briskly up the hill, and presently stepped onto the pavement. But at the edge of the asphalt, where tufted grass should grow, something crackled and hissed under my feet. Under the torchlight the unnatural grass was white and brittle with rime, fanciful as a stage fairy scene, and the railings beyond it glittered too. I slid in the road as I turned down the drive. A sheet of ice was spread where the leaky pipe is, and the steps up to the house door were slippery. But oh, the honeysuckle and the rose trees! Bush, plant, leaf, stem, rimed from end to end. The garden was a Bond Street jeweler's. Perhaps the final chapter on Mr. Pettit. In the excitement of the ward I had almost forgotten him. He is buried in the mess in the days when I lived on the floor below. To-night, as I was waiting by the open hatch of the kitchen for my tray to be filled with little castles of lemon jelly, the hot blast from the kitchen drawing stray wisps of hair from beneath my cap, I saw the familiar limping figure, a figure bound up with my first days at the hospital, evoking 100 evenings at the concerts in the dining room. I felt he had been away, but I didn't dare risk a "so you're back." He smiled, blushed, and limped past me. Upstairs in the ward, as I was serving out my jellies, he arrived in the doorway, but avoiding me, hobbled round the ward, visiting every bed but the one I was at the moment. Then he went downstairs again. I passed him on the stairs. He can't say he didn't have his opportunity, for I even stopped with my heavy tray and spoke to him. Half an hour later he was back in the ward again, not his ward, and this time he found the courage of hysteria. There in the middle of the ward, under the glaring Christmas lights, with the eyes of every interested man in every bed glued upon us, he presented me with a fan wrapped in white paper. "A little present I bought you, nurse." I took it, eyes sizzling and burning holes in my shoulders, and stammered my frantic thanks. "You do like it, nurse?" he said, rapidly, 3 times in succession. And I do, I do, I do. "I thought you would. You do like it?" "Oh, just what I wanted." "That's all right, then. Just a little Christmas present." We couldn't stop. It was like taking too much butter for the marmalade and too much marmalade for the butter. He leaves the hospital in a day or 2. The fog is still thick. To-night at the station, after a day off, I found it white and silent. Touching the arm of a man, I asked him the all-important question, "Are the buses running?" "Oh, no." And the cabs all gone home to bed, and I was hungry. What ghosts pass, and voices, bodiless, talking intimately, while their feet fall without a stir on the grass of the open heath. I was excited by the strange silent fog. But my left shoe began to hurt me, and stopping at the house of a girl I knew, I borrowed a country pair of hers. No taller than I, she takes 2 sizes larger. They were like boats. I started to trudge the 3 miles home in the boats. The slightest flick of the foot would have sent one of them flying beyond the eye of God or man. After a couple of miles the shoes began to tell, and I stood still and lifted up one foot behind me, craning over my shoulder to see if I could catch sight of the glimmer of skin through the heel of the stocking. The fog was too thick for that. Another half mile, and I put my finger down to my heel and felt the wet blood through a large hole in my stocking. So I took off the shoes and tied them together, and, more silent than ever in the tomb of fog, padded along, as God had first supposed that woman would walk, on the wet surface of the road. A warded M.O. is pathetic. He knows he can't get well quicker than time will let him. He has no faith. Tomorrow I have to take down all the decorations that I put up for Christmas. When I put them up, I never thought I should be the one to take them down. When I was born, no one thought I should be old. While I was untying a piece of holly from the electric light cords on the ceiling, and a patient was holding the ladder for me, a young padre came and pretended to help us, but while he stood with us, he whispered to the patient, "Are you a communicant?" I felt a wave of heat and anger. I could have dropped the holly on him. They hung up their stockings on Christmas night on walking sticks hitched over the ends of the beds and under the mattresses. Such big stockings. Many of them must have played Father Christmas in their own homes to their own children on other Christmases. On Christmas Eve I didn't leave the hospital till long after the day sisters had gone and the night sisters came on. The wards were all quiet as I walked down the corridor, and to the left and right, through the glass doors, hung the rows of expectant stockings. Final and despairing postscript on Mr. Pettit. When a woman says she cannot come to lunch, it is because she doesn't want to. Let this serve as an axiom to every lover. A woman who refuses lunch refuses everything. The hospital is alive. I feel it like a living being. The hospital is like a dream. I am afraid of waking up and finding it commonplace. The white sisters, the ceaselessly changing patients, the long passages, the sudden plunges into the brilliant wards, their scenery hypnotizes me. Sometimes in the late evening one walks busily up and down the ward, doing this and that, forgetting that there is anything beyond the drawn blinds, engrossed in the patients, one's tasks, bed-making, washing, one errand and another. And then, suddenly, a blind will blow out and almost up to the ceiling, and through it you will catch a glimpse that makes you gasp, of a black night crossed with bladed searchlights, of a moon behind a crooked tree. The lifting of the blind is a miracle. I do not believe in the wind. A new sister on tonight, very severe. We had to make the beds like white cardboard. I wonder what she thinks of me. Mr. Pettit, who really is going tomorrow, wandered up into the ward and limped near me. "Sister," he began. He will call me sister. I frowned at him. The new sister glanced at him and blinked. He was very persistent. "Sister," he began again, "do you think I can have a word with you?" "Not now," I whispered as I hurried past him. "Oh, is that so?" he said, as though I had made an interesting statement, and limped away, looking backwards at me. I suppose he wants to say good-bye. He sat beside Mr. Wicks's bed, Mr. Wicks who is paralyzed, and looked at me from time to time with that stare of his which contains so little offence. It is curious to think that I once saw Mr. Wicks on a tennis lawn walking across the grass, Mr. Wicks who will never put his foot on grass again, but lying in his bed continues to say, as all Tommies say, "I feel well in meself." So he does. He feels well in himself. But he isn't going to live all the same. Still his routine goes on. He plays his game of cards, has his joke. "Lemonade, please, nurse, but it's not from choice." When I go to clear his ashtray at night, I always say, "Well, now I've got something worth clearing at last." And he chuckles and answers, "Thought you'd be pleased. It's the others gets round my bed and leaves their bits." He was once a sergeant. He got his commission a year ago. My ruined charms cry aloud for help. The cap wears away my front hair, my feet are widening from the everlasting boards, my hands won't take my rings. I was advised last night on the telephone to marry immediately before it was too late. A desperate remedy. I will try cold cream and hair tonics first. There is a tuberculosis ward across the landing. They call it the TB ward. It is a den of coughs and harrowing noises. One night I saw a negro standing in the doorway with his long hair done up in hairpins. He is the pet of the TB ward. They call him Henry. Henry came in to help us with our Christmas decorations on Christmas Eve, and as he cleverly made wreaths, my sister whispered to me, "He's never spitting in the ward?" But he wasn't. It was part of his language. Little clicks and ticks. He comes from somewhere in Central Africa, and one of the TBs told me he's only got one wife, nurse. He is very proud of his austerity, for he has somehow discovered that he has hit on a country where it is the nutty thing only to have one wife. No one can speak a word of his language, no one knows exactly where he comes from, but he can say in English, "Good morning, sister," and "Christmas box," and "one." Directly one takes any notice of him, he laughs and clicks, holding up one finger, crying, "One." Then a proud TB, they regard him as the Creator might regard a hummingbird, explains, "He means he's only got one wife, nurse." Then he did his second trick. He came to me with outstretched black hand, and took my apron, fingering it. Its whiteness slipped between his fingers. He dropped it, and holding up the hand with its fellow, ducked his head to watch me with his glinting eyes. "He means," explained the versatile TB, "that he has 10 pickaninnies in his village, and they're all dressed in white." It took my breath away. I looked at Henry for corroboration. He nodded earnestly, coughed, and whispered, "10." "How do you know he means that?" I asked. "How can you possibly have found out?" "We got pictures, nurse. We showed him kids, and he said he got 10, 6 girls and 4 boys. We showed him pictures of kids." I had never seen Henry before, never knew that he existed. But in the ward opposite, the poor TBs had been holding conversations with him in window seats, showing him pictures, painfully establishing a communion with him. Henry with his hair done up in hairpins. Although they showed him off with conscious pride, I don't think he really appeared strange to them beyond his color. I believe they imagine his wife as appearing much as their own wives, his children as the little children who run about their own doorsteps. They do not stretch their imaginations to conceive any strangeness about his home surroundings to correspond with his own strangeness. To them Henry has the dignity of a man and a householder, possibly a ratepayer. He seems quite happy and amused. I see him carrying a bucket sometimes, sharing its handle with a flushed TB. They carry on animated conversations as they go downstairs, the TB talking the most. It reminds me of a child and a dog. What strange machinery is there for getting him back? Part of the cargo of a ship one day? A nigger for Central Africa? Where's his unit? Who knows? One nigger in his bundle for Central Africa. The ward has put Mr. Wicks to Coventry, because he has been abusive and violent-tempered for 3 days. He lies flat in his bed and frowns. No more jokes over the lemonade, no willfulness over the thermometer. It is in these days that Mr. Wicks faces the truth. I lingered by his bed last night, after I had put his tea-tray on his table, and looked down at him. He pretended to be inanimate, his open eyes fixed upon the white rail of the bed. His bedclothes were stretched about him as though he had not moved since his bed was made hours before. His worldly pleasures were beside him, his reading lamp, his Christmas box of cigars, his star. But his eyes, disregarding them, were upon that sober vision that hung around the bed rail. He began a bitter conversation. "Nurse, I'm only a ranker, but I had a bit saved. I went to a private doctor and paid for myself, and I went to a specialist, and he told me I should never get this. I paid for it myself, out of what I had saved." We might have been alone in the world, he and I. Far down at the other end of the room the men sat crouched about the fire, their trays before them on chairs. The sheet of window behind Mr. Wicks's head was flecked with the morsels of snow, which, hunted by the gale, obtained a second's refuge before oblivion. "I'd sooner be dead than lying here. I would really." You hear that often in the world. "I'd sooner be dead than—" But Mr. Wicks meant it. He would sooner be dead than lying there. And death is a horror, an end. Yet he says lying there is worse. You see, I paid for a specialist myself, and he told me I should never be like this. There was nothing to be said. One must have one's tea. I went down the ward to the bunk, and we cut the pink iced cake left over from Christmas. I did not mean to forget him, but I forgot him. From birth to death we are alone. But one of the sisters remembered him. Mr. Wicks is still in the dumps, she remarked. What is really the matter with him, sister? Locomotor ataxy. And she added as she drank her tea, it's his own fault. Oh, hush, hush, my heart cried soundlessly to her. You can't judge the bitterness of this nun from your convent. Alas, Mr. Wicks, no wonder you saved your money to spend upon specialists. How many years have you walked in fear of this? He took your money, that gentleman in Harley Street, and told you that you might go in peace. He blessed you and gave you salvation. And the bitterest thing of all is that you paid for him like an officer, and he was wrong. How the blinds blew and the windows shook tonight! I walked out of the hospital into a gale. Clouds driving to the sea, trees bending back and forth across the moon. I walked till I was warm, and then I walked for happiness. The maddening shine of the moon held my eyes, and I walked in the road like a fool, watching her, till at last, bringing my eyes down, the telegraph posts were small as blades of grass on the hillside, and the shining ribbon tracks in the mud on the road ran up the hill forever. They go to Dover, and Dover is France, and France leads anywhere. To what lost enchantment am I recalled by the sight of a branch across the moon? Something in childhood, something which escapes, yet does not wither. As I passed the public house on the crest of the hill, all black and white in the cold moonlight, a heavy door swung open, and with a cough and a deep satisfied snuffle, a man coming out let a stream of gaslight across the road. If I were a man, I should certainly go to public houses. All that polished brass and glass, boxed up away from the moon and the shadows, would call to me. And to drink must be a happy thing when you have climbed the hill. The T.B. ward is a melancholy place. There is a man in a bed near the door who lies with his mouth open. His head is like a bird cage beneath a muslin cloth. I saw him behind his screens when I took them over a little lukewarm chicken left from our dinner. There was a dark red moon to-night, and frost. Our orderly said, "You can tell it's freezing, nurse, by the breath," as he watched mine curl up in smoke in the icy corridor. I like people who notice things. Out in the road in front of the hospital I couldn't get the motor bicycle to work, and sat crouched in the dark, fiddling with spanners. The charwomen came out of the big gate in the dark, talking and laughing, all in a bunch. One of them stepped off the pavement near me and stopped to put her toe through the ice in the gutter. "Now, come on, Mrs. Toms." "I always have to break it, it's so nice and stiff," she said as she ran after them. To be a sister is to have a nationality. As there are Icelanders, urbane, witty, lazy, and yet they are all Icelanders, so there are cold, uproarious, observant, subservient, slangy, sympathetic, indifferent, and Scotch sisters, and yet... Sister said of a patient to-day, he was a funny man. A funny man is a man who is a dark horse, who is neither friendly nor antagonistic, who is witty, who is preoccupied, who is whimsical or erratic. Funny qualities, unsafe qualities. No sister could like a funny man. In our ward there are 3 sorts of men: nothing much, nice boys, and Mr. Wicks. The last looms even to the mind of the Sister as a biblical figure, a pillar of salt, a witness to God's wrath. The Sister is a past mistress of such phrases as, "Indeed, that is a matter of opinion. We shall see. It is possible." I have discovered a new and, for me, charming game which I play with my sister. It is the game of telling the truth about the contents of my mind when asked. Yesterday Sister was trying to get some coal out of the coal bin with a shovel that turned round and round on its handle. She was unsuccessful. I said, "Let me, Sister." She said, "Why?" And I, "Because I think I can do it better." "Why should you think that?" "Because all human beings do," I said, and luckily she smiled. She was washing her caps out in a bowl in the afternoon when I came on. "Good afternoon, Sister," I said. "Ironing?" "I am obviously only washing as yet," she said. "It's because I think so quickly, Sister," I said. "I knew you would iron next." I dined with Irene last night after the hospital. I refused to believe what she told me about the last bus passing at 9:30, and so at 9:45 I stood outside the green lamp and waited. 10 minutes passed and no bus. With me were 2 women waiting too, one holding a baby, the other, younger, smarter, dangling a purse. At last I communicated my growing fears. I believe the last has gone. We fixed our 6 eyes on the far corner of the road, waiting for the yellow lights to round it, but only the gas lamps stood firm in their perspective. "Oh my, Elsie," said the woman with the baby, "you can't never walk up to the crossroads in the dark alone." "I wouldn't make the attempt, not for anything," replied the younger one firmly. Without waiting for more, I stepped into the middle of the road and started on my walk home. The very next sentence would have suggested that Elsie and I should walk together. She wouldn't make the attempt. Her words trailed through my mind, conjuring up some adventure, some act of bravery and daring. The road was the high road, the channel of tarmac and pavements that she probably walked along every day. And now it was the self-same high road, the same flagstones, hedges, railings, but with the cloak of night upon them. It wasn't man she feared. Even in the dark I knew she wasn't that kind. She would be awfully capable with man. No, it was the darkness, the spooky jungle of darkness. She feared the trees would move. I wouldn't make the attempt, not for anything, and the other woman had quite agreed with her. I knew where I was by the smells and the sounds on the road, the smell of the lines of picketed horses behind the railings, the sharp and sudden stamp of the sick ones in the wooden stables, and later on the glitter of water in the horse troughs. I thought, I'm not afraid. Is it because I am more educated or have less imagination? "Halt! Who goes there?" "Friend," I said, thrilling tremendously. He approached me and said something which I couldn't make anything of. Presently I disentangled, "You should never dread the bayonet, miss." "But I'm not dreading," I said, annoyed. I love it." He said he was cold, and added, "I been wounded. If you come to that lamp, you can see me stripe." We went to the lamp. "It's them busses," he complained. "They won't stop when I 'alt 'em." "But why do you want to stop them? They can't poison the horse troughs." "It's me duty," he said. "There's one coming." A bus coming the opposite way bore down upon us with an unwieldy rush and roar, the last bus in a hurry to get to bed. "You'll see," he said pessimistically. "'Alt! 'Alt there!" The bus, with 3 soldiers hanging on the step, rushed past us, and seemed to slow a little. The sentry ran a few paces towards it, crying, "Halt!" But it gathered speed and boomed on again, buzzing away between the gas lamps. He returned to me sadly. "I don't believe they can hear," I said, and gave him some chocolates and went on. As I passed the hospital gates, it seemed there was a very faint, sweet smell of chloroform. I was down at the hospital to-night when the factory blew up over the river. The lights went out, and as they sank I reached the kitchen hatchway with my tray. At the bottom of the stairs I could see through the garden door the sky grown sulphur and the bushes glowing, while all the panes of glass turned incandescent. Then the explosion came. It sounded as though it was just behind the hospital. 200 panes of glass fell out, and they made a noise too. Standing in the dark with a tray in my hand, I heard a man's voice saying gleefully, "I haven't been out of bed this 2 months." Someone lit a candle, and by its light I saw all the charwomen from the kitchen bending about like broken weeds, and every officer was saying, "There, there now." We watched the fires till midnight from the hill. I went over this morning early. We were 32 in a carriage. Lascars, Chinese, children, Jews, niggers from the docks. Lascars and children and Jews and I, we fought to get off the station platform. Sometimes there wasn't room on the ground for both my feet at once. The fires were still burning and smoldering there at midday, but a shower of rime fell on it, so that it looked like an old ruin, something done long ago. At Pompeii someone told me one looked into the rooms and they were as they had been left, tables laid. Here, too, I saw a table laid for the evening meal, with a bedstead fallen from the upper floor astraddle across it. The insides of the houses were coughed into their windows, basket chairs hanging to the sills, and fire irons. Outside, the soil of the earth turned up, a workman's tin mug stuck and roasted and hardened into what looks like solid rock, a fossil as though it had been there forever. London is only skin deep. Beneath lies the body of the world. The hump under the blankets rolls over, and a man's solemn face appears upon the pillow. "Can you get me a book, nurse?" "Yes. What kind do you like?" "Nothing fanciful. Something that might be true." "All right." "Oh, and nurse." "Yes." "Not sentimental, and not funny. I like a practical story." I got him Lord Jim. Another voice. "Nurse, is there any modern French poetry in that bookcase?" "Good heavens, no! Who would have brought it here?" Who are they all, these men with their differing tastes? Perhaps the angels feel like this as they trail about in heaven with their wings flapping on their thin white legs. Who were you, angel? "I was a beggar outside San Marco." "Were you? How odd! I was an Englishman." The concerts that we give in the ward touch me with some curious emotion. I think it is because I am for once at rest in the ward, and have time to think and wonder. There is Captain Thompson finishing his song. He doesn't know what to do with his hands. They swing. He is tall and dark, with soft eyes and staff badges. Could one guess what he is? Never in a dozen years. But I know. He said to me last night, "Nurse, I'm going out to-morrow." I leaned across the table to listen to him. "Nurse, if you ever want any crêpe de chine for nightgowns, mind, at wholesale prices." "I have bought some at a sale." "May I ask at what price?" 4 and 11 a yard. Pity you could have had it from me at 3. He gave me his business card. That's it, nurse, he said, as he wrote on the back of it. Drop me a line at that address, and you'll get any material for underwear at trade prices. He booked 1 or 2 orders the night he went away. Not laughingly, not as a joke, but with deep seriousness, and gravely pleased that he was able to do what he could for us. He was a traveller in ladies' underwear. I have seldom met any one so little a snob. Watch Mr. Gray singing. 1 hand on the piano, 1 on his hip. I love every mouse in that old-fashioned house. That fellow can sing, whispers the man beside me. Is he a professional? I asked, as, finishing, the singer made the faintest of bows and walked back to his chair. I think he must be. He is, whispered Mr. Matthews. I've heard him before. They know so little about each other, and they don't ask. It is only I who wonder, I, a woman, and therefore of the old burnt-out world. These men watch without curiosity, speak no personalities, form no sets, express no likings, analyze nothing. They are new-born. They have as yet no standards, and do not look for any. Ah, to have had that experience too! I am of the old world. Again and again I realize a nation in arms. Watchmakers, jewelers, station-masters, dress designers, actors, travelers in underwear, bank clerks. They come here in uniforms, and we put them into pajamas and nurse them, and they lie in bed or hobble about the ward, watching us as we move, accepting each other with the unquestioning faith of children. The outside world has faded since I have been in the hospital. Their world is often near me, their mud and trenches, things they say when they come in wounded. The worst of it is, it almost bores me to go to London, and London was always my Mecca. It is this garden at home, I think. It is so easy not to leave it. When you wake up, the window is full of branches, and the last thing at night the moon is on the snow on the lawn, and you can see the pheasants' footmarks. Then one goes to the hospital. When Madeline telephones to me, "I'm living in a whirl," it disturbs me. Suddenly I want to, too, but it dies down again. Not that it is their world, those trenches. When they come in, wounded or sick, they say at once, "What shows are on?" Mr. Wicks has ceased to read those magazines his sister sends him. He now stares all day at his white bed-rail. I only pass him on my way to the towel cupboard twice an evening, and then, as I glance at him, I am set wondering all down the ward of what he thinks, or if he thinks. I may be quite wrong about him. It is possible he doesn't think at all, but stares himself into some happier dream. One day, when he is dead, when he is as totally dead as he tells me he hopes to be, that bed with its haunted bed-rail will bend under another man's weight. Surely it must be haunted. The weight of thought, dream or nightmare, that hangs about it now is almost visible to me. Mr. Wicks is an uneducated and ordinary man. In what manner does his dream run? Since he has ceased to read, he has begun to drop away a little from my living understanding. He reflects, deeply at times. To-night, as I went quickly past him with my load of bath-towels, his blind flapped a little, and I saw the moon, shaped like a horn, behind it. Dropping my towels, I pulled his blind back. "Mr. Wicks, look at the moon!" Obedient as one who receives an order, he reached up to his supporting handle and pulled his shoulders half round in bed to look with me through the pane. The young moon, freed from the trees, was rising over the hill. I dropped the blind again and took up my towels and left him. After that he seemed to fall into one of his trances, and lay immovable an hour or more. When I took his dinner to him, he lifted his large sandy head and said, "Seems a queer thing that if you hadn't said, 'Look at the moon,' I might have been dead without seeing her." "But don't you ever look out of the window?" The obstinate man shook his head. End of Part 1 of Inside the Glass Doors, from A Diary Without Dates, by Enid Bagnold. Read by Maria Casper. Part 2 of Inside the Glass Doors, from A Diary Without Dates, by Enid Bagnold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Diary Without Dates, by Enid Bagnold. Chapter 2, Inside the Glass Doors, Part 2. There was a long silence in the ward to-night. It was so cold that no one spoke. It is a gloomy ward, I think. The pink silk on the electric fires is so much too thick, and the fire smokes dreadfully. The patients sat round the fire with their British warms over their dressing gowns, and the collars turned up. Through the 2 glass doors and over the landing you can see the TBs moving like little cinema figures, backwards and forwards, across the lighted entrance. Suddenly a hesitating touch. An ancient polka struck up, a tune remembered at children's parties. Then a waltz, a very old one too. The TBs were playing dance music. I crept to their door and looked. One man alone was taking any notice, and he was the player. The others sat round, coughing or staring at nothing in particular, and those in bed had their heads turned away from the music. The man whose face is like a bird cage has now more than ever a look of an empty cage. He allows his mouth to hang open. That way the bird will fly. What is there so rapturous about the moon? The radiance of a floating moon is unbelievable. It is a figment of dream. The metal silver ball that hung at the top of the Christmas tree, or, earlier still, the shining thing, necklace or spoon, the thing the baby leans to catch, the magpie in us. Mr. Beecher is to be allowed to sleep till 8. He sleeps so badly, he says. He woke up crying this morning, for he has neurasthenia. That is what Sister says. He should have been in bed all yesterday, but instead he got up and through the door watched the dead TB ride away on his stretcher, for the bird flew in the night. How morbid of him, Sister says. He has seen many dead in France, and snapped his fingers at them, but I agree with him that to die of tuberculosis in the backwaters of the war isn't the same thing. It's dreary. He thought how dreary it was as he lay awake in the night. But then he has neurasthenia. Pity is inexhaustible. What a terrible discovery! If one ceases for one instant to pity Mr. Wicks, he becomes an awful bore. Some days when the sun is shining I hear his grieving tenor voice all over the ward, his legendary tale of a wrong done him in his promotion. The men are kind to him, and say, "Old man," but Mr. Gray, who lies in the next bed to him, is drained of everything except resignation. I heard him say yesterday, "You told me that before." We had a convoy last night. There was a rumor at tea-time, and suddenly I came round a corner on an orderly full of such definite information as, There's 30 officers, nurse, and 180 men." I flew back to the bunk with the news, and we sat down to our tea, wondering and discussing how many each ward would get. Presently the haughty sister from downstairs came to the door. She held her thin white face high, and her rimless glasses gleamed, as she remarked over casually, after asking for a hot water bottle that had been loaned to us, "Have you many beds?" Have they many beds? The one question that starts up among the competing wards. And "I don't want any, I've enough to do as it is the false cloaking answer that each sister gives to the other. But my sisters are frank women. They laughed at my excitement, themselves not unstirred. It's so long since we've had a convoy. The gallants of the ward showed annoyance. New men, new interests. They drew together and played bridge. A little flying boy with bright eyes said in his high piping voice to me across the ward, "So there are soldiers coming into the ward to night." I paused, struck by his accusing eyes. "What do you mean, soldiers?" "I mean men who have been to the front, nurse." The gallants raised their eyebrows and grew uproarious. The gallants have been saying unprofessional things to me, and I haven't minded. The convoy will arm me against them. Soldiers are coming into the ward. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. If only one could eat something. I took a sponge finger out of a tin, resolving to pay it back out of my tea next day, and stole round to the dark corner near the German ward to eat it. The Germans were in bed. I could see 2 of them. At last, freed from their uniform, the dark blue with the scarlet soup plates, they looked, how strange, like other men. One was asleep. The other, I met his eyes so close, but I was in the dark, and he under the light of a lamp. I knew what was happening down at the station 2 miles away. I had been on station duty so often. The rickety country station, lit by one large lamp, the 13 waiting V.A.D.s, the long wooden table loaded with mugs of every size, kettles boiling, the white clock ticking on, that frowsy booking clerk. Then the sharp bell, the tramp of the stretcher-bearers through the station, and at last the 2 engines drawing gravely across the lighted doorway, and carriage windows filled with eager faces, other carriage windows with beds slung across them, a vast red cross, a chemist's shop, a theatre, more windows, more faces. The stretcher men are lined up. The M.O. meets the M.O. with the train. The train sisters drift into the coffee table. Here they come. Walkers first. The station entrance is full of men crowding in and taking the steaming mugs of tea and coffee. Men on pick-a-back with bandaged feet. Men with only a nose and one eye showing, with stumbling legs, bound arms. The station for 5 minutes is full of jokes and witticisms. Then they pass out and into the waiting charabancs. A long pause. Stretchers. The first stretchers are laid on the floor. There I have stood so often, pouring the tea behind the table, watching that littered floor, the single gas lamp ever revolving on its chain, turning the shadows about the room like a wheel. My mind filled with pictures, emptied of thoughts, hypnotized. But last night, for the first time, I was in the ward. For the first time I should follow them beyond the glass door, see what became of them, how they changed from soldiers into patients. The gallants in the ward don't like a convoy. It unsexes us. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, another biscuit. Both Germans are asleep now. At last a noise in the corridor, a tramp on the stairs. Only walkers? No, there's a stretcher, and another. Now reflection ends, my feet begin to move, my hands to undo bootlaces, flick down thermometers, wash and fetch and carry. The gallants play bridge without looking up. I am tremendously fortified against them. For one moment I fiercely condemn, and then forget them. For I am without convictions, antipathies, prejudices, reflections. I only work and watch. Watch. Our ward is divided. Half of it is neat and white and orderly. The other half has khaki tumbled all over it, Sam Browns, boots, caps, mud, the caked mud from the other side. But the neat beds are empty, the occupants out talking to the newcomers, asking questions. Only the gallants play their bridge unmoved. They are on their mettle, showing off. Their turn will come some day. Now it remains only to walk home, hungry, under a heavy moon. The snow is running down the gutters. What a strange and penetrating smell of spring! February! Can it be yet? The running snow is uncovering something that has been delayed. In the garden a blackbird made a sudden cry in the hedge. I did smell spring, and I'm starving. I thought last night that a hospital ward is, above all, a serene place. In spite of pain and blood and dressings, gravity rules it, an order and a quiet procession of duties. Last night I made beds with the eldest sister. The eldest sister is good company to make beds with. She is quiet unless I rouse her, and when I talk she smiles with her eyes. I like to walk slowly round the ward, stooping and rising over the white beds, flicking the sheets mechanically from the mattress, and finally turning the mattress with an ease which gives me pleasure because I am strong. In life nothing is too small to please. Once during the evening the eldest sister said to me, "I am worried about your throat. Is it no better?" And from the pang of pleasure and gratitude that went through me, I have learnt the value of such remarks. In every bed there is some one whose throat is at least more sore than mine. Though I am not one of those fierce V.A.D.'s who scoff at sore throats and look for wounds, yet I didn't know it was so easy to give pleasure. The strange, disarming ways of men and women! I stood in the bunk to-night beside the youngest sister, and she looked up suddenly with her absent stare and said, "You're not so nice as you used to be." I was dumbfounded. Had I been nice? And now, different. What a maddening sentence! For I felt that she was going to refuse me any spoken explanation. But one should not listen to what people say, only to what they mean, and she was one of those persons whose minds one must read for oneself, since her words so often deformed her thoughts. The familiarity and equality of her tone seemed to come from some mood removed from the hospital, where her mistrustful mind was hovering about a trouble personal to herself. She did not mean, "You are not so nice," but "You don't like me so much." She was so young, it was all so new to her, she wanted so to be liked, but there was this question of her authority. How was she to live among her fellows? Can one afford to disdain them? Can one steer happily with indifference? Must one, to be liked, bend one's spirit to theirs? And most disturbing question of all, is to be liked the final standard? Whether to wear or not to wear a mask towards one's world, for there is so much that is not ripe to show, change and uncertainty. As she sat there, unfolding to me the fogs of her situation, her fresh pink face clouded, her grand cap and red cape adding burdens of authority to the toil of growth. I could readily have looked into the glass to see if my hair was gray. "Then there is nothing you condemn?" said the youngest sister finally, at the close of a conversation. "I have to-day come up against the bedrock of her integrity. It is terrible. She has eternal youth, eternal fair hair, cold and ignorant judgments. On things relating to the world I can't further soften her. A man must do the rest." "A gentleman, a gentleman! I am so tired of this cry for a gentleman. Why can't they do very well with what they've got? Here in the wards the sisters have the stuff the world is made of, laid out, bedded before their eyes, the ups and downs of man from the 4 corners of the empire and the 100 corners of social life, helpless and in pajamas, and they're not satisfied, but must cry for a gentleman. I couldn't make a friend of that man," the youngest sister loves to add to her criticism of a patient. "It isn't my part as a V.A.D. to cry, 'Who wants you to?' I couldn't trust that man," the youngest sister will say equally often. This goes deeper. But whom need one trust? Brother, lover, friend, no more. Why wish to trust all the world? "They are not real men," she says, "not men through and through." That's where she goes wrong. They are men through and through, patchy, ordinary, human. She means they are not men after her pattern. Something will happen in the ward. Once I have touched this bedrock in her, I shall be forever touching it till it gets sore. One should seek for no response. They are not elastic, these nuns. In all honesty, the hospital is a convent, and the men in it my brothers. This for months on end. For all that, now and then, some one raises his eyes and looks at me. One day follows another, and the glance deepens. Charme de l'amour qui pourrait vous peindre. Women are left behind when one goes into hospital. Such women as are in a hospital should be cool, gentle. Anything else becomes a torment to the prisoner. For me, too, it is bad. It brings the world back into my eyes. Duties are neglected, discomforts unobserved. But there are things one doesn't fight. Charme de l'amour. The ward is changed. The eldest sister and the youngest sister are my enemies. The patients are my enemies. Even Mr. Wicks, who lies on his back with his large head turned fixedly my way to see how often I stop at the bed whose number is 11. Last night he dared to say, "It's not like you, nurse, staying so much with that rowdy crew." The gallants! I know, but one among them has grown quieter, and his bed is number 11. Even Mr. Wicks is my enemy. He watches and guards. Who knows what he might say to the eldest sister? He has nothing to do all day but watch and guard. In the bunk at tea I sit among thoughts of my own. The sisters are my enemies. I am alive, delirious, but not happy. I am at anyone's mercy. I have lost 30 friends in a day. The 31st is in bed number 11. This is bad. Hospital cannot shelter this life we lead, number 11 and I. He is a prisoner, and I have my honor, my responsibility towards him. He has come into this room to be cured, not tormented. Even my hand must not meet his, no, not even in a careless touch, not even in its duty. Or if it does, what risk? I am conspired against. It is not I who make his bed, hand him what he wishes. Some accident defeats me every time. Now that I think of it, It seems strange that the sisters should be my enemies. Don't we deserve sympathy and pity, number 11 and I? From women, too. Isn't there a charm hanging about us? Aren't we leading magic days? Do they feel it and dislike it? Why? I feel that the little love we have created is a hare whose natural fate is to be run by every hound, but I don't see the reason. We don't speak, number 11 and I, only a whispered word or two that seems to shout itself into every ear. We don't know each other. Last night it was stronger than I. I let him stand near me and talk. I saw the youngest sister at the far end of the ward by the door, but I didn't move. She was watching. The moment I took my eyes from her, I forgot her. That is how one feels when one is desperate. That is how trouble comes. Later, I stood down by the hatch, waiting for the tray of fish, and as I stood there, the youngest sister beside me, he came down, for he was up and dressed yesterday, and offered to carry the tray, for he is reckless too. She told him to go back, and said to me, looking from her young, condemning eyes, "I suppose he thinks he can make up for being the cause of all the lateness to-night." Sister, and then I stopped short. I hated her. Were we late? I looked at the other trays. We were not late. It was untrue. She had said that because she had had to wrap her barb in something and hadn't the courage to reprove me officially. I resented that and her air of equality. Since I am under her authority and agree to it, why dare she not use it? As for me, I dared not speak to her all the evening. She would have no weapons against me. If I am to remember she is my sister, I must hold my hand over my mouth. She would not speak to me either. That was wrong of her. She is in authority, not I. It is difficult for her because she is so young. But I have no room for sympathy. At moments I forget her position, and burning with resentment, I reflect, this schoolgirl. To-day I walked down to the hospital thinking, I must be stronger. It is I who, in the inverted position of things, should be the stronger. He is being tortured, and he has no release. He cannot even be alone a moment. But at the hospital gates I thought of nothing but that I should see him. In the bunk sat the eldest sister, writing in a book. It passed through my head that the two sisters had probably sat on my affairs together. I wondered without interest what the other had told her. Putting on my cap, I walked into the ward. Surely his bed had a pink eiderdown. I walked up the ward and looked at it, but I knew without need of a second glance what had happened. His bed was made in the fashion in which we make an empty bed, a bed that waits for a new patient. His locker was empty and stood open, already scrubbed. I smiled as I noticed they hadn't even left me that to do. No one volunteered a word of explanation. No one took the trouble to say that he had gone. These women. I smiled again. Only the comic phrase rang in my head, "They've properly done me in, properly done me in." I went downstairs and fetched the trays, and all the time the smile was on my lips. These women. Somehow I had the better of the sister. It is better to be in the wrong than in the right. His friends looked at me a little, but apparently he had left no message for me. Later I learnt that he had been taken to another hospital at 2, while I came on at 3. Once during the evening the eldest sister mentioned vaguely, "So and so has gone," and I said aloud, after a little reflection, "Yes, in the nick of time, sister." During the evening I realized that I should never see him again. It was here in this ward the thing had grown. The hair we had started wouldn't bear the strain of any other life. He might write, but I shouldn't go and see him. He must be wild, I thought with pity. The feeling between us would die anyhow. Better throw in my strength with the sisters and help her hurl it now towards its death. I looked at her bent head with a secret triumph. Then, slowly, how permanently am I in disgrace? And she, not at all, now. Behind the stone pillar of the gateway is one dirty little patch of snow. I saw it even in the moonless darkness. The crown of the hill here holds the last snows, but for all that the spring smell is steaming among the trees and up and down the bracken slopes in the garden next door. There is no moon, there are no stars, no promise to the eye, but in the dense, vaporing darkness the bulbs are moving. I can smell what is not earth or rain or bark. The curtain has been drawn over number 11. The sister holds the corners tightly against the window frame. He is outside, somewhere in the world, and I am here, moving among my 30 friends, and since it isn't spring yet, the lights are lit to hide the twilight. The sister's eyes talk to me again as we make beds. Yes, even bed number 11, with a little jaundice boy in it. They let me make it now. Last night we had another concert in the ward. A concert demoralizes me. By reason of sitting on the beds and talking to whom one wills, I regain my old manners, and forget that a patient may be washed, fed, dressed, but not talked to. My old manners were more gracious, but less docile. Afterwards we wheeled the beds back into their positions. I bumped Mr. Lambert's as I wheeled it, and apologized. "I'm not grumbling," he smiled from his pillow. "You never do," I answered. "You don't know me, nurse." And I thought, as I looked down at him, I shall never know him better, or so well again. Indeed, a sister is a curious creature. She is like a fortress, unassailable, and whose sleeping guns may fire at any minute. I was struck with a bit of knowledge last night that will serve me through life. That is, that to justify oneself is the inexcusable fault. It is better to be in the wrong than in the right. A sister has an intimate life. It occurs when she goes off duty. That is to say, it lies between 8:45, when she finishes her supper, and 10 o'clock, when she finishes undressing. That is why one sister said to me, "If I hadn't taken up nursing, I should have gone in for culture." I don't laugh at that. To have an intimate life, one must have a little time. Who am I that I can step in from outside to criticize? The hospital is not my life. I am expectant. But for them, here and now is the business of life. As the weeks go by, I recognize the difficulty of keeping the life of the Sisters and the V.A.D.'s out of the circle of my thoughts. Their vigorous and symmetrical vision of the ward attacks me. Their attitude towards the patients, which began by offending me, ends by overtaking me. On the whole, the Sisters loathe relations. They look into the ward and see the mothers and sisters and wives camped round the beds, and go back into the bunk feeling that the ward doesn't belong to them. The eldest sister said to me yesterday, "Shut the door, nurse. There's Captain Fellows's father. I don't want him fussing around." On that we discussed relations, and it seemed to me that it was inevitable that a sister should be the only buffer between them and their pressing anxieties. "No, a relation is the last straw. You don't understand," she said. I don't understand, but I am not specialized. Long ago, in the mess, I said to my sister, laughing, I would go through the 4 years' training just to wear that cap and cape. And she, You couldn't go through it and come out as you are. Mr. Wicks has set his heart on crutches. If you won't try me on them, I'll buy me own and walk out of here. Then I realize the vanity of his threat and the completeness of his imprisonment, and hurry to suggest a new idea before he sees it too. We set him on crutches. He is brave. He said with anger, "I can't stand on these. They're too long. You go and ask for some shorter ones." And thus together we slurred over the fact of that pendulous, nerveless body which had hung from the crutches like an old stocking. But all the evening he was buried in his own silence, and I suppose he was looking at the vision on the bed rail. A boy of 17 was brought in yesterday with pneumonia. He was so ill that he couldn't speak, and we put screens round his bed. All the other patients in the ward immediately became convalescents. I helped Sister to wash him, holding him on his side while he groaned with pain, and Sister, no longer cynical, said, "There you are, sonny, it's almost finished." When I rolled back the blanket, it gave me a shock to see how young his feet were, clean and thin, with the big toe curling up and the little toes curling back. "Will you brush my hair?" he managed to say to me, and when I had finished, "This is a pretty ward." It isn't, but I am glad it seems so to him. The boy is at his worst. Whenever we come near to him, he lifts his eyes and asks, "What are you going to do now?" But to whatever we do he submits with a terrible docility. Lying there, propped on his pillow, with his small yellow face staring down the ward, he is all the center of my thoughts. I am preoccupied with the mystery that is in his lungs. 5 days ago he was walking on his legs. 5 days, and he's on the edge of the world, to-night looking over the edge. There is no shell, no mark, no tear. The attack comes from within. The others in the ward are like phantoms. When I say to-morrow, "How is the boy?" what will they say? The sun on the cobwebs lights them as it lights the telephone wires above. The cocks scream from every garden. To-day the sky is like a pale egg-shell, and aeroplanes from the 2 aerodromes are droning round the hill. I think from time to time, is he alive? Can one grow used to death? It is unsafe to think of this. For if death becomes cheap, it is the watcher, not the dying, who is poisoned. His mother buys a cake every day and brings it at tea-time, saying, "For the sisters' tea." It is a bribe, dumbly offered, more to be on the safe side of every bit of chance than because she really believes it can make the slightest difference. Now that I have time to think of it, her little action hurts me. But yesterday I helped to eat it with pleasure, because one is hungry, and the margarine not the best. Aches and pains, pains and aches. I don't know how to get home up the long hill. Measles. Unposted. Dear Sister, 4 more days before they will let me out of bed. Whatever I promise to a patient in future I shall do if I have to wear a notebook hanging on my belt, by which you will see that I am making discoveries. The quality of expectation in a person lying horizontally is wrought up to a high pitch. One is always expecting something. Generally it is food. 3 times a day it is the post. Oftener it is the performance of some promise. The things that one asks from one's bed are so small. Can you get me a book? Can you move that vase of flowers? When you come up next time, could you bring me an envelope? But if one cannot get them, life might as well stop. The wonder to me is how they stood me. I was always cheerful. I thought it a merit. I find, instead, it is an exasperation. I make 100 reflections, since my eyes are too bad to read. I stare at the ceiling, and if a moth comes on it, and just now that happened, or I would not have thought of mentioning it, I watch the pair of them, the moth and its leaping shadow, as they whirl from square to square of the smoke-ripened ceiling. This keeps my thoughts quiet. Then in the daytime there is the garden, the dog that crosses the lawn, the gardener talking to himself, the girl who goes to feed the hens. I don't say that in any of these things I find a substitute for reading, but since I can't and mayn't read, I am thinking, you know, of the beds down the right-hand side of the ward. There's Mr. Wicks now. He has his back to the road with the trams on it. Do you see anything in that? I do. But then I have the advantage of you. My position is horizontal. Mr. Wicks's position is also strictly horizontal. It seems to me that if he could see those trams, mark Saturdays and Sundays by the increase of passengers, make little games to himself involving the number of persons to get on and off, for the stopping place is within view, I know, for I looked, it might be possible to draw him back from that apathy which I too, as well as you, was ceasing to notice. Mr. Wicks, sister, not only has his back to the road with the trams on it, but for 11 months he has had his eyes on the yellow stone of the wall of the German ward, that is, when they are not on his own bed rail. But if his bed were turned round to range alongside the window, for he is a man with 2 eyes, not one who can write upon a stone wall with his thoughts. And yet it would be impossible. There's not a ward in the hospital whose symmetry is so spoilt. And that, you know, is a difficulty for you to weigh. How far are you a dictator? I have been thinking of my role and yours. In the long run, however capable I become, my soul should be given to the smoothing of pillows. You are barred from so many kinds of sympathy. You must not sympathize over the deficiencies of the hospital, over the food, over the M.O.'s lack of imagination, over the intolerable habits of the man in the next bed. You must not sigh, I know, to any of these plaints. Yours is the running of the ward, yours the isolation of a crowned head. One day you said a penetrating thing to me. He's not very ill, but he's feeling wretched. Run along and do that sympathetic V.A.D. touch. For a moment I, just able to do a poultice or a fomentation, resented it. But you were right. One has one's métier. End of Part 2 of Inside the Glass Doors, from a Diary Without Dates by Enid Bagnold. Read by Maria Casper.